Recording in progress.
All righty. Good morning, everybody. This is the October 13th, 2021 morning session of the Portland City Council. Keelan, good morning. Please call the roll.
Good morning, Mayor. Good morning, Commissioners. Maps.
Here.
Rubio.
Here.
Ryan.
Here.
Hardesty.
Here.
Wheeler.
Here. Under Portland City Code and state law, the City Council is holding this meeting electronically. All members of the council are attending remotely by video and teleconference, and the city's made several avenues available to the public to listen to the audio broadcast of this meeting. The meeting's available to the public on the city's YouTube channel, eGovPDX, www.portlandoregon.gov/video, and channel 30. The public can provide written testimony to the council by emailing the council clerk at cctestimony@portlandoregon.gov. Council is taking these steps as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to limit in-person contact and to promote physical distancing. The pandemic is an emergency that threatens the public health, safety, and welfare, which requires us to meet remotely by electronic communications. Thank you all for your patience, your flexibility, and your understanding as we manage through these challenging circumstances to conduct the city's business. With that, we're going to hear from legal counsel on the rules of order and decorum. Good morning.
Good morning, Mayor. To participate in council meetings, you may sign up in advance with the council clerk's office for communications to briefly speak about any subject. You may also sign up for public testimony on resolutions or first readings of ordinances. The published council agenda at portlandoregon.gov/auditor contains information about how and when you may sign up for testimony while the city council is holding electronic meetings. Your testimony should address the matter being considered at the time. When testifying, please state your name for the record. Your address is not necessary. Please disclose if you're a lobbyist. If you are representing an organization, please identify it. The presiding officer determines the length of testimony. Individuals generally have 3 minutes to testify unless otherwise stated. When your time is up, the presiding officer will ask you to conclude. Disruptive conduct, such as shouting, refusing to conclude your testimony when your time is up, or interrupting others' testimony or council deliberations will not be allowed. If there are disruptions, a warning will be given that further disruption may result in the person being placed on hold or ejected from the remainder of the electronic meeting, and a reminder that all council meetings are recorded.
All right, good. Thank you. First up is communications. First item, Keelan, item number 737.
Request of Tristan Sakamoto to address council regarding equity and diversity in the city.
Good morning.
Good morning. Hello, Mayor Wheeler and Commissioners. My name is Tristan, and I am an employee of the City of Portland, although currently off the clock. Today, I'm here for myself as a concerned and aware fellow human. What I say today might be difficult to hear and may even trigger some feelings that you have. I simply ask that you listen with an open mind and heart. My intentions are good, and I believe that together we can make a more equitable city, state, and country. We can stand knowing that we not only speak words of inclusivity, but show others how committed we are. I want to begin by recognizing the time and effort that is put into equity and diversity trainings, committees, meetings, and resources around the city so employees can learn and grow for themselves and the community we serve. I completed a 4-hour equity training a couple of weeks ago, and one key phrase that stuck with me was intent versus impact. While I recognize the city's dedication to education, I do feel the city is lacking in being fully committed to creating a diverse and equitable city. In June of 2020,
Tristan, we're having troubles hearing you. You broke up right after in June 2020. Can you start from that point? We didn't hear you.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
In June of 2020, the City of Portland passed Resolution 37492, which states, in short, adopt anti-racism, equity, transparency, communication, collaboration, and fiscal responsibility as the core values of the city. I think there are several things that the city can do to put these core values into action. because this resolution is not just what City Council interprets it to be, but rather the impact it has on those it is meant to serve. Are we collaborating with the community and providing an equitable city for all? Nearly a month ago, City Council made it a condition of employment to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19. For the first time ever, a medicine's ineffectiveness is being blamed on those who have not taken it. The vaccinated can still contract and transmit COVID-19. Therefore, the vaccinated and unvaccinated should be treated equally. How can we achieve our goals of equity and inclusion when every barrier that is removed is replaced with a different barrier? Shouldn't we allow people to make their own medical decisions without government interference? Last year, many marched the streets proclaiming Black Lives Matter as an act of unity and inclusion. But today there is a toxicity on our nation. It is creating segregation and division. An equitable society is fair inclusion into a society in which all people can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. Mandating people and their children who have consciously chosen not to get vaccinated is a recipe for creating new and deeper fractures within our society, the kind of fractures that we may profoundly regret in hindsight. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Resolution 37443, which was passed in July of 2019. This resolution begins supporting the right to bodily autonomy. This resolution was written in support of abortion, but those words lead the impact statement, and it seems intent versus impact is quite lost on this. Roe versus Wade wasn't about a woman's right to abortion. It was about her right to medical privacy. All of us should have the opportunity to choose what is best for ourselves and our families through research and education, particularly against a virus that most healthy individuals can and will survive. The COVID vaccination is a matter of personal health, not public health, as the benefits rest primarily with the individual, not society. Government officials have no greater moral authority to mandate a vaccination as they do to mandate chemotherapy. You have tasked us with identifying and eliminating barriers, and we are working so hard to accomplish this task. I think we can do more to make our city and state more equitable and welcoming for all. You have a platform to take a powerful stance and stand for freedom on behalf of the American people. But I wonder if you have the courage. City Council, do you believe we are all equal and we should collaborate to create a country that is welcoming for all?
Tristan, I think we're starting, we lost you there just at the last minute, but we let you go a little long. But so thank you for your comments today. We appreciate it. Thank you for being here.
And their personal choices, contractors, volunteers, employees.
Am I the only one who's not? Okay. Is it just me or is the sound screwed up today, you guys? Is it just my thing or are you having problems too?
Yeah, I'm having problems.
Okay. Tristan, I don't know if you can hear me. You cut out, but thank you. We appreciate your being here and thank you for your work for the city. Thank you for your perspective. Next individual, please. Item number 738, Keelan.
Request of Dr. Brooke Batchelor to address council regarding tree code and mother tree in Multnomah Village.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound good. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, Mayor Wheeler and members of the City Council, my name is Dr. Brooke Batchelor. She, her pronouns. I'm a family physician in the community standing in solidarity with the now 2,521 of your constituents who've signed a petition to protect and preserve this great mother fir tree and her firkin at 7301 Southwest 26th Avenue. I honestly never saw myself as someone who would be moved to testify about something like this. I read about this story. I went to the site to see these trees for myself. And while I was there, I saw a tree right in front of me held captive by various ropes, and it was carelessly sawed down without a second thought. And I honestly felt so extraordinarily overwhelmed. Just like that, a century was lost. And as a family physician who thinks a lot about how systems affect the health of my patients, this personal experience led me to think more about our current system, the health of my community, and numerous benefits these trees bring us. In addition to older trees being better sequesters of carbon compared to younger trees, trees reduce particulate matter, one of the most dangerous to our lungs. And these are the kind we see with forest fires and from burning of fossil fuels in our cities. This is the kind of pollution that disproportionately affects those with lower socioeconomic status. Trees in urban settings have been shown to reduce stress, anger, depression, and anxiety. And honestly, there couldn't be a better time to have them around. Simply put, we can't separate our health from the health of trees. None of us are exempt from this. Our current system fails to place the interests of the community at the forefront and prioritizes short-term financial gain from developers. By removing trees like this, there's an externalized cost that is unaccounted for in the current tree codes on mental and physical health of the people of Portland. It matters today because the cumulative effect of actions we take today determine the trajectory of our community. I feel the urgency in seeing the wildfires, experiencing these hot summers, and seeing Mount Hood bare. And when I care for my patients with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and asthma, which are very common illnesses. So what do? We have a few days to a few weeks, and you are the only ones who can change this. We elected you and are trusting you to act in our best interest. The choice to do nothing or allowing these trees to be cut down is absolutely detrimental to the health of the community and does not feel morally sound to me. We must find a way to allow for more sustainable development in the city that also leaves these critical trees standing, utilizing creative approaches like allowing shared driveways, waiving sidewalk requirements, or allowing setbacks. I feel this urgency, and I speak the truth in support of my health and the health of my patients and on behalf of your constituents. I truly appreciate your time and attention to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Batchelor. We appreciate your being here and drawing attention to this issue. Thank you. Next up, 739, please. Next individual.
Request of Donna Cohen to address council regarding routes in North Portland that would fail in an earthquake.
Good morning. Donna, are you on? Keelan, is Donna in the queue?
Yes, she was. We were getting her promoted so she could share her screen. I'm not sure. Maybe she dropped off.
Why don't you go to the next individual and see if you can work Donna in the meanwhile?
Okay, great. Request of Wayne Wiggins to address council regarding a second opinion on O'Brien Square.
Good morning. Wayne, you there?
Morning. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Oh,
Good.
I'm sorry that it was making me rejoin the meeting.
Okay, so Donna, is that you?
Can I go now?
Yeah, Wayne, can you wait just a minute and we'll have Donna go first, okay?
No problem.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Donna, it's yours.
Okay, great, thanks. Good morning, Council. I'm here to talk about and I hope you read the recent draft report on the effect of a major earthquake on the critical energy infrastructure hub along the Willamette River, a report from the city and the county. This sums it up that the impact can be on a par with the 2011 Fukushima nuclear meltdown in Japan. And what I want to point out here, this is the critical energy infrastructure here in orange. I'm assuming you can all see this right now. Willamette River, St. John's Bridge. This is St. John's and Cathedral Park. St. John's is a lower income, diverse community. This is the cut. The cut is basically a trench that was built for the railroad to come through. And across this cut are three small bridges over Lombard, Willamette, and Fessenden. And then on Columbia, also a bridge. And recently, on a walk with Pbot, I was told that all of these would fail in such an earthquake, and that the earthquake and the destruction of the CEI is likely to bring about a toxic cloud that we will be trapped within because there will be no evacuation routes here across the cut. So it's crucial that the city looks at these locations and to make recommendations for them to be seismically sound. I believe they're held by the railroad. We need to look at taking the authority away from the railroad to the city. And we need to keep the community informed. And of course, we are starting to organize. This is a huge issue. And also, of course, we need to look at the larger issues related to the CEI hub and its effect on what will happen during an earthquake. Sharon Myron has been involved with this. We all want to see an intergovernmental committee to work on these issues. Now, last night, I was made aware of another critical piece here, and that is that this is the cut, as I mentioned. There is also a railroad bridge about 3/4 of a mile east that cuts through the Portsmouth and University Park areas. Sorry, that's my cat. And both the cut and the bridges over the cut and the railroad bridge were built circa 1910. So we are talking about these all failing in the anticipated earthquake and leaving the residents of University Park, Portsmouth, St. John's Cathedral Park, and Rivergate workers stranded to be engulfed in a toxic cloud with no evacuation route. So, I hope you can see here the danger involved. We're talking tens of thousands of people who would be sacrificed if we don't immediately start to look. It takes years to fix these things, I know, and we need to have Pbot and whoever else is appropriate immediately start to evaluate these structures and work our way. I mean, we have some extra money now. I know it should go certainly toward starting this process.
Donna, I'm going to stop you.
Okay,
you're a minute over and you've made your point very, very well. Plus, I see Commissioner Hardesty has a comment as well.
Okay.
Thank you for being here. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Donna. One of the things I know about you is that when you dig in deep. And I am always grateful for both of your advocacy and your deep knowledge about the issues that you take on. Having said that, since I showed up here 3 years ago, it has been a priority working with the city and the county to identify and with our attorneys to figure out every avenue to ensure the critical energy infrastructure is addressed. Folks were doing it long before I got here, but we are halfway to all the knowledge we need to take very intentional actions. As you know, there's another part 2 of the study is being done now. I've worked very closely with Multnomah County and the Bureau of Emergency Management and the regional disaster coordinating council, right? None of this is new information. We've all been terrified about the significant human and financial impact of what happens, not if, but when a big earthquake happens. So just know that this is not new information. We are working it from every angle possible. And I appreciate the community advocacy, continuing to educate yourself and being a partner and helping us make sure that you've pointed out one area of the city. There's so many areas of the city that will be absolutely destroyed if we do nothing. And
we won't be able to escape. That's the thing, the toxic air.
Let me just say toxic air will be everywhere. And you're right.
Others can escape, but we won't have an escape route.
Many people won't. So again, you're not giving us new information. We've been working on this very intentionally. So we will keep talking, and thank you again for your
Thank
advocacy.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. Wayne, thank you for your patience. You're up.
Okay, good morning. Apologies in advance if I cut out. I'm on my way to work this morning, so I just posted up in a park. I don't know if you guys can see me. I don't see my video popping up, but my name is Wayne Wigness. About 2 years ago, I made a public records request on O'Brien Square, and I received a report that was made by the engineering firm that did the analysis on the underground parking garage. It was a very large report, but it was mostly just pictures and layouts of the park. The results were summarized in less than 1 page, and it boiled down to some discoloration and water leaks. Now, I used to go to potluck in the park, and on bad weather days, they do it underground. So I got to see these leaks for myself. And I thought they were relatively minor, but and they weren't on the weight-bearing beams themselves. They're along the sidewalls. Now, anytime a building or a structure collapses, there's usually large amounts of standing water involved, or notable deterioration on the steel framework, or just severe damage to the concrete. But there was none of that at O'Brien. It was by comparison, it was kind of minor. But in the worst case, I failed to see why we didn't just backfill it with, gravel and concrete, or some of that high-tech steel foam we have nowadays, or maybe just add a few temporary support beams while we wait to demo it. But I don't think closing the whole park was ever warranted. A second opinion is warranted because there's so many ulterior agendas at play with this park. For example, some of you may recall the Terminal 1 fiasco, in which a homeless shelter was being disputed for use along the waterfront. And shortly after this, O'Brien Square. Well, there was one developer who came out very strongly against in the Terminal 1 case. And I noted he also happened to be opening an office right next to O'Brien Square when it closed. Now, in both cases, I believe it was Nick Fish who had the final say in this. And this is not to call to question the integrity of Nick Fish, may he rest in peace, but even the best of us are not immune to bias. On a second note, real quickly, with regard to the Safe Rest Villages, I wanted to say, were we to diversify our concept of an outdoor shelter, we could double or triple the number of people we accommodate. We could strive to serve the whole homeless population, not just those who are willing to submit to our program. And we could give these places a much needed sense of community. Right now, not to be insulting, but they kind of look like jail cells, and I don't even see any benches for people to hang out, and that's important. It's kind of what I consider the white elephant of homeless conversations. A lot of people overlook the fact that a lot of people out here, they're just lonely, and they develop lonely, and then they develop connections on the street. They miss their street family and things like that. And there's the need for freedom as well. And we need to respect that. I was thinking something like R2D2 minus the rats, lay out some cots underneath the canopy and let people sleep for 8 hours a night. And that would be a very cost-efficient means of achieving our ends. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Appreciate it. Thanks for your testimony.
Excuse me, Mayor.
Commissioner Hardesty, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to also thank Wayne for his testimony and let him know that my office is actively working on O'Brien Square. And we're hoping to have some progress on funding repairs soon. And we'll be working, of course, with Commissioner Rubio's office to make sure that we continue to move forward.
Right on. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is the consent agenda. Keelan, have any items been pulled off consent?
We've had no requests.
Please call the roll.
Maps,
Got that? Aye.
Rubio,
Aye.
Ryan,
Aye.
Hardesty,
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. Consent agenda is adopted. First time certain item 741, please.
Proclaim October 15th, 2021 to be White Cane Safety Day.
Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. White Cane Safety Day is October 15th, designated so by a joint resolution of Congress in 1964. A white cane is a mobility aid commonly used by people who are blind or who have low vision. White canes help individuals navigate their environment with greater independence and confidence. The white cane, in effect, makes someone's hands and arms longer so that they can assess the situation and move quickly and confidently. The white cane allows users to avoid obstacles, find steps and curbs, locate and step over cracks, or uneven places in the sidewalk, find doorways, get into cars and buses, and much, much more. Oregon law 811.035 requires drivers to stop and stay stopped for people using a white cane or accompanied by a guide dog. There are similar laws in all 50 states. White cane users would like every day to be White Cane Safety Day. They want to be able to move safely on our public rights of way every day, not just October 15th. Pbot will be hosting an online celebration of White Cane Safety Day on Thursday, October 14th at noon. Governor Kate Brown also issued a proclamation. And on a personal note, I can't think of a better way to celebrate my birthday than to have it on White Cane Safety Day. It is really, I understand that we're all just temporarily able, and it's really important that we as a community embrace all the diversity that our community has. And so I am proud of the work that Pbot continues to do to acknowledge White Cane Safety Day. And I still have fond memories of meeting at PSU in the park blocks, celebrating in person. One day we'll be able to do that again. But until then, please keep an eye out for white canes and for guide dogs and for people who move about our community differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty, and an early happy birthday to you. A couple of days early, but congratulations, you made it to another one. I always view that as a great victory, so best to you. Colleagues, before I make some brief comments and read the proclamation, I'd entertain comments at this time. Commissioner Mapps.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty, Mr. Mayor, and colleagues. I'm delighted to join you in proclaiming October 15, 2021 to be White Cane Safety Day here in Portland. Now, this day is known by many different names, including White Cane Day, White Cane Awareness Day, and Blind American Equality Day. Although the names may vary, each of these names refers to the same idea. On this day, we celebrate the achievements of people who are blind or visually impaired. And on this day, we recommit ourselves to full integration, equality, education, and economic opportunity for Americans with visual impairments. White Cane Safety Day has been celebrated in the United States since 1964, when President Lyndon Baines Johnson proclaimed October 15 of each year as White Cane Safety Day. Now, it's no coincidence that White Cane Safety Day was created by LBJ in 1964, the same era when the nation passed landmark civil rights legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Voting Rights Act of 1965. White Cane Safety Day is part of a civil rights revolution which started more than 60 years ago and continues to this day. In the 57 years since our nation celebrated its first White Cane Safety Day, Americans with visual disabilities have come a long way. They've become leaders in government and business, academics, and the arts. The visually impaired are our friends, family, and neighbors. And one day, the visually impaired might just be us. While blind people and people with low vision are freer and more prosperous than ever before, much work remains to be done. That is true even here in Portland. For example, this year, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention ranks Portland 29th on their list of best and worst cities for people with disabilities. Now, you might ask yourself, what's the reason for Portland's mediocre score here? Well, it comes down to Portland's high cost of living and our uneven healthcare system. And colleagues, I also have a personal story to share that illustrates our city's shortcomings serving visually impaired Portlanders. I spent last Friday afternoon out at the Bureau of Emergency Communications. While I was there, we took multiple 911 calls about a gentleman with a white cane walking along the side of a highway. Now, I do not know how that blind gentleman wound up on the side of a Portland freeway, but I do know that it is a clear sign that Portland's social safety net failed this gentleman. We must do better. And that's what White Cane Safety Day is about. On this day, the city and the citizens of Portland recommit ourselves to securing full and equal access to education and employment for visually impaired Portlanders. On White Cane Safety Day, we recommit to making Portland a more just and equitable city for visually impaired residents. On this day, we recommit to expanding inclusion, economic opportunity, and liberty for Portlanders with visual disabilities. And finally, on White Cane Safety Day, this council recognizes and thanks the many city staff who support and advocate for Portland's disabled community. And on this day, of course, we thank Oregon's Commission for the Blind for the great work they do. That's why I'm proud to join my colleagues on this council in proclaiming October 15, 2021 to be White Cane Safety Day here in Portland. I encourage all Portland residents to join me in observing this day. For those reasons and more, I am going to vote aye. Thank you.
Commissioner Ryan.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Commissioner Hardesty, for bringing this forward. Your comments and your context, Commissioner Hardesty, were really helpful. And I think it's worth repeating that we are all just temporarily able. For me, I'll be real quick, but I just grew up very close with two of my cousins, and my mom's youngest sister had two children, and both lived life as legally blind since birth. So for me, it was really wonderful to be taught through their lens, if you will, about the world for someone with that disability. And so this proclamation is close to my heart, and I'm really grateful that we're acknowledging it today. And also, happy birthday. Thanks.
Commissioner Rubio.
Thank you. And thank you, Commissioner Hardesty and Mayor Wheeler, for bringing this proclamation forward. It's really important to raise awareness for our visually impaired community members. And again, I'm going to go back to what Commissioner Hardesty said, that we're only temporarily able. That really struck me when you said that. It's a true reminder for all of us. And it's certainly been true for many of our families and our friends, including my own family. It's incumbent upon us in our roles to lift up this awareness and do what we can to ensure accessibility and accommodations for all residents of all abilities now in our roles. And it should be top of our minds in our decisions every day. So again, thank you to the community members for lifting this up. Thank you to Commissioner Hardesty and Mayor. Thanks, community members, for your advocacy and for this important reminder of our own responsibilities.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio. So before I read the proclamation, I just want to give a heartfelt thanks to the crew at Pbot, to Commissioner Hardesty, and of course for the Pedestrian Safety Action Coalition, otherwise known to many of us here as PSAC, for bringing forward this proclamation. The Pedestrian Safety Action Coalition is a group of blind and low vision pedestrians that meet monthly to discuss safety and events and raise awareness of white cane and guide dog users in our city. I'm particularly grateful to PSAC Chair Mary Lee Turner, thank you, and PSAC members Darian Slayton Fleming and Jean Marie Moore for their dedication and their advocacy on behalf of blind and low vision pedestrians. Thank you, Mary Lee, Darian, and Jean. And now I'll read the proclamation on behalf of the City Council. Whereas blindness or visual impairment affects persons from infancy through old age, and whereas people who are blind or visually impaired enjoy all the rights, benefits, and privileges of living, working, playing, and traveling in this great city of Portland. And whereas white canes and guide dogs are tools that people who are blind or visually impaired use to identify themselves and to travel independently while enjoying these rights, benefits, and privileges. And whereas people of all ages who are blind or visually impaired have the right to travel safely while conducting their business of living. And whereas in 1964, the United States Congress adopted a joint resolution designating October 15th each year as a day of education and celebration of the advent of white canes for independence and for safe travel. And whereas this great city of Portland calls upon public officials, members of civic organizations, and all people in the city of Portland to join together as we work to ensure the benefits and privileges in our great city are available to persons who are blind or visually impaired. Now, therefore, I, Ted Wheeler, Mayor of the City of Portland, Oregon, the City of Roses, do hereby proclaim October 15th, 2021 to be White Cane Safety Day in Portland and encourage all residents to observe this day. Thank you all. Keelan, we're just in time for the second time certain item, please. Item number 742.
Direct Portland Bureau of Transportation and Bureau of Planning and Sustainability to develop an implementation plan for a suite of equitable mobility fees and investments based on principles recommended by the Pricing Options for Equitable Mobility Task Force.
Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm excited to introduce the next agenda item, the Pricing Options for Equitable Mobility, which goes by PORM. Project report and community task force recommendations. While I was not the commissioner in charge of Pbot when PORM project kicked off, I remember voting a little more than 2 years ago now to direct Pbot and BPS, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, to establish this committee. The same thing was true then that is true now. We're facing big challenges in our transportation system, and we need new ideas to move beyond the status quo to a better future. But those new ideas must be rooted in improving equitable outcomes. First and foremost, for BIPOC Portlanders, low-income households, and people with disabilities. That's why I've been excited about this project. Before we could truly consider implementing pricing, I lost my spot, hang on. Let's see. I've been excited about this project. Before we could truly consider implementing pricing, we needed to have a community conversation about whether pricing can be an equitable tool for moving towards the system we want. And in fact, over the last 2 years, our transportation system challenges have only become more pronounced. We don't have time to waste. We must do more to address the climate crisis, make our streets safer for everyone, and make our systems more equitable. We're also facing a transportation funding crisis. We cannot tackle any of these problems without sufficient revenue. I know that pricing should first and foremost be about reducing driving and climate emissions and managing our system better. But the revenue it raises can also be reinvested and help to accomplish these goals. As an elected leader rooted in community, I am inspired and motivated by the energy and commitment the PORM Task Force members brought to this process. And by the way, they worked throughout the entire pandemic, never took a break. So most of all, I want to thank the PORM Task Force members for their time, dedication during one of the hardest years in all of our lives. They showed up, they put in the work, they asked tough questions, and they really were truly leaders. I am very much looking forward to hearing their recommendations to us this morning and continuing to work with Commissioner Rubio as we move forward.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. I too am really excited to introduce this resolution. I'm proud that the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability has partnered with Pbot and Pelham Community Task Force on this project over the last 18 months. And it too was also, it started prior to my time here, but I was quickly moved by just how important this work is and continues to be. Over a year ago, the city declared a climate emergency. And as the Bureau leading climate efforts for the city, I know this is a critical conversation for BPS to be supporting. Curbing rising transportation emissions is absolutely critical to meeting our climate goals, and we must act now. And as an activated city, doing that means making urgent headway on several interrelated fronts, including reducing driving, shifting the trips that remain to electric and low carbon fuels, and planning and building connected, inclusive, and complete communities so that everyone has access to essential services in their neighborhoods. And as in all our climate work, I'm also committed to the city moving on these fronts in a way that improves outcomes for our Black, Indigenous, and people of color community members, low-income households, and persons with disabilities. Because it's not just all about reducing emissions, it's about achieving climate justice and addressing the disproportionate burdens these groups experience while averting climate catastrophe. The task force has considered all of those critical parts of our transportation climate strategy. And that's why I'm really excited for us to hear about these specific recommendations around how pricing can improve mobility, climate, and equity outcomes. And before we begin with the presentation, I'd like to echo Commissioner Hardesty's words of gratitude for the dedicated time, thoughtful work, and complex conversations that the task force members put into this work. Task force members, I'm very grateful to each one of you for helping us to achieve better, more strategic, and effective policy recommendations, and ones that uphold and hold us to our values. You're very deeply appreciated by us, and we thank you for your service. So with that, I'll turn it over to Director Warner and Director Durbin to kick off the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Commissioners Hardesty and Rubio. We really appreciate your leadership as we're moving forward. For the record, I'm Chris Warner. I'm Director of the Portland Bureau of Transportation. And thank you for having us here today. We're very excited to share with you the recommendations that have come from the POEM Task Force. As you've heard, this task force was convened jointly by Pbot and BPS to tackle the hard questions around congestion pricing. Today, we will begin by recapping why we convened the POEM Task Force. Then we will share the task force recommendations with you. And finally, we hope that you will vote to direct Pbot and BPS to continue to take this work to the next stage. As you will hear, the task force asks us to take bold steps and to advance pricing strategies to create a more climate-friendly, safer, and equitable transportation system. We're excited to be at this milestone and share the recommendations with you. At the same time, we know that we have work yet to do with deeper analysis, additional outreach, more specific policy design for each of the specific pricing strategies before we really are ready to implement them. We are very pleased to share these recommendations, and I look forward to the additional work that lies ahead. And at this moment, I'll turn it over to Director Durbin.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners. For the record, I'm Andrea Durbin, Director for Planning and Sustainability. And I am also excited to be here today with Director Warner, introducing the Council presentation and resolution. BPS has been proud to sponsor and partner in this work with Pbot. This work on pricing options for equitable mobility and this resolution is a critical piece of our city's climate work. In July, you received an update from our bureaus about the Climate Emergency Declaration, the progress we have made, as well as the real challenges we face to meet our critical carbon reduction targets in the next 8.5 years, cutting an additional 30% of emissions by 2030. The sobering punchline is this: the climate crisis is accelerating, the impacts are intensifying, and the impacts are not equitable. BIPOC and low-income communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change, poor air quality, traffic delays, and traffic crashes. Transportation sector emissions, and as Winona LaDuke put it in our recent tribal relations training, our fossil fuel addiction are responsible for a significant portion of our climate problem. The easy stuff has been done. Time is growing short, and the next steps require strong political commitment and a sense of urgency, prioritization, and resources. It's also important to understand that the longer we wait, the higher the costs will be. Costs of inaction on climate is significant in terms of human and economic costs. People in our community are already dying because of climate change. The city must advance complementary strategies to reduce carbon alongside pricing to improve equitable mobility outcomes. Pricing is just one policy tool, and it works in conjunction with other strategies. For instance, in transportation, smart land use policies for connected communities, affordable housing and more housing options, electrifying vehicles and investments in multimodal options must also be a part of our plan, which will create a more equitable and sustainable mobility system. That's why the POEM project is so important. It tackled tough questions head on and did so in collaboration with a community task force, several members of which you will hear from today. I also want to extend my appreciation to these thoughtful community members for their engagement and hard work during this process and during a very challenging time in our lives. I hope you will support this resolution today, asking us to take their recommendations forward and support us in turning them into specific policy proposals in the months ahead. Now I'll turn it back to Director Warner. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Durbin. Before handing it over to the POEM project managers who will elaborate on the task force process and recommendations, I want to remind you about this strategy that we shared with you during the climate emergency update in July. This triangle shows Pbot's strategy for reducing transportation emissions by 2030. It has three parts. First is to plan and build connected, inclusive, complete communities and a transportation system that supports climate-friendly trips. Second, transition to cleaner fuels and electric low-carbon vehicles. And third, which is really critical, reduce the miles that are driven and shift to more multimodal trips like walking, biking, and transit. To that last point, and the top of the triangle, Pbot has been leading work over the last couple of years to understand what tools are the most effective for reducing miles driven, also known as demand management. This work has led to the development of a strategy that we call our Way to Go plan. The research and analysis that went into the Way to Go plan reveals that one of the most impactful demand management strategies is pricing. Furthermore, pricing is an intriguing tool because it can be designed to encourage a shift to electric vehicles and generate funding to support multimodal transportation investments. But while pricing shows promise as a tool for advancing our climate strategy, we also know that it raises questions about equity. Sure, it may work, but does it work for Portland? Could it work in a way that helps people and goods move more freely and safely through the city, addresses a climate crisis, and makes our system more equitable? Because if it doesn't, then it's probably not a right strategy for Portland. Well, here's the good news. For the past year and a half, we've been working with this incredible task force to dig into this question. And thanks to their great leadership and thoughtful engagement, we're ready to hit the ground running with this critical work. I'm excited to turn this over to our project managers, Shoshana Cohen and Emma Sagor, to share more about the POEM project, the task force recommendations, and the path forward. So Emma and Shoshana, I'll have you take it away.
Good morning, Mayor. Good morning, Commissioners, and thank you for your time this morning. For the record, I'm Shoshana Cohen, and I'm one of the POEM project managers, and I too am really excited to be here with you this morning, sharing the results of the task force work. Before we dive into the recommendations prepared by the POEM Community Task Force, I want to set the scene and address just a couple of foundational questions. They've already been touched upon in these introductions, but to go just a little bit slower and deeper. What are we really talking about when we talk about pricing, and why exactly are we talking about it now? So in this context, pricing means charges for driving or using roadway space. These charges or price signals help people to consider the real value of the space, as well as the real costs or impacts of using that space or of driving. And while pricing can generally help to capture this value and these costs, it can also be a flexible tool designed to vary based on the different sort of cost captures and values that you want to achieve with a particular project. It can vary based on time of day, prices can vary based on congestion level, location, number of people in a car, fuel efficiency of a car, or whether it's an electric vehicle or not, or even income level of people using the car. So it can really be a very variable, flexible tool. And for this project, we've been looking at 5 different types of pricing. We've been looking at parking pricing, something which we already use, but how we could design it in different ways. We've been looking at prices on vehicle-based commercial services, sometimes known as transportation network companies or Uber and Lyft, as well as urban delivery vehicles that have been growing in our city. We've been looking at highway tolling or pricing, something that ODOT is actually looking at right now on I-5 and I-205. We've been looking at cordons or area pricing, which are charges for driving into a particular area of a city, often a central city, but it could be a different area. And we've been looking at road usage, or sometimes called per mile charges, where a charge is exactly that, just based on the amount of miles that are being driven. So again, why are we looking at all these types of pricing? It's a pretty safe assumption that asking people to pay more for using road space, especially road space they consider to be free right now, is going to be a difficult conversation and is going to be unpopular. However, we're not talking about charging costs on a transportation system that's working really perfectly well right now. We're not saying everything's great, we're going to add more costs, increase some burdens, and and have that sort of conversation. Instead, we're talking about a transportation system which already has many costs, which we are all paying in many ways, even if we don't always look at them sort of exactly every time we get in the car, if they're not sort of immediately apparent. So we already mentioned at the beginning the climate crisis and the significant carbon emissions coming from the transportation sector as one of the costs that we're all paying from our very auto-centric transportation system, and one of the reasons that we're considering pricing. However, there are really many additional challenges with the transportation status quo, the way it is right now, and with this auto dependence. Fatalities and serious injuries remain tragically high on our system. Driving trips and congestion pre-pandemic had been on a significantly increasing upward trajectory. Early in the pandemic, they dipped, but now we've seen them come back and they're close to pre-pandemic levels, and again on an upward trajectory. And congestion isn't something that's just sort of it can be frustrating for all of us in our car, but it has real costs. There's costs in lost time, there's economic costs to businesses, costs to individuals. So these are just some of the many challenges with the system the way we have it today. And these challenges impact all of us, but really importantly, we also know that this transportation status quo has disparate and inequitable impacts. I think it was already mentioned, we know that vulnerable communities are often hardest hit by the extreme weather that we are all already beginning to experience with climate change. We also see evidence of disparities across many different indicators. For instance, in Portland, there's data that almost 30% of Black households currently don't have access to a vehicle, and this compares with only 12% of white households. We also know that the death rate from traffic crash injuries among Black Multnomah County residents is significantly higher than the rate among white residents. So again, the system isn't working for all of us, and it has deep inequities, and that's why we're considering the role of pricing and making some changes. Before going a little bit further, I do also want to be clear that while this is all very true and we have heard over and over the need to do better and change this, we also understand that there are many reasons that people drive. And while we're having a conversation that is ultimately about sending signals and helping people make different choices, we have to keep in mind that right now, our city is set up in a way that it is often easiest and the only choice for people to drive, whether they're going to a job and where there's no other options to get through, the bus doesn't go there, there's no good bike lanes, whether they're taking their kids somewhere and they have to get to daycare and pick them up and they don't have more time, or whether it's because people have been pushed out of areas where there maybe were more easier options and now they have farther to go. So as we have this conversation about limiting trips, we have to continue to balance the reasons that people drive and continue to make it easier and easier for them to have other options. And the task force discussed this a lot, but we just want to continue to acknowledge that tension as we had this discussion. Finally, there's one other piece of background information that's sort of important context in this conversation. The conversation we were having with the task force really was driven by it was a conversation around pricing as a policy tool to advance our climate goals, to advance our mobility goals, to advance our equity goals. It wasn't a conversation of really driven by how can we raise revenue. But of course, pricing does raise revenue. And this context of transportation funding is important. Transportation funding hasn't kept up with inflation for years. And transportation funding has also declined as cars have become more fuel efficient. And again, we want cars to become more fuel efficient. We want to move to more electric vehicles. We want to move away from fossil fuel dependency, but we must also address the need for funding our transportation system as this happens. And funding has been going down at the same time that we're facing increasing demands on our system. These increasing demands come from population growth. They come from new types of shared mobility, as well as new driving trips like TNCs and on-demand urban delivery. So all of those are the many challenges we're facing. How do we address these? How do we make the system better? Well, Pbot, and often in partnership with BPS and other partner bureaus, we're sort of hard at work all of the time to create more multimodal transportation system, to make investments and improve our multimodal facilities, to offer different types of mobility services like bike share, to provide education for people so they know about different possibilities and they can be safe, programs like Safe Routes to School, to offer things like our transportation wallet, which provides people incentives to use different modes. We're doing all of this, and Pbot is really good at it. And we're known for being a city, and the city of Portland is good at it. We're known for being a city with many multimodal options. And we need to continue doing all that. There's no single solution. But the fact remains that even while we're making progress, and we will continue to make progress, we're not making enough progress towards creating the safe, climate-friendly, and equitable system that we want to see. And that brings us to the fact that we think we need new tools and we need a little bit stronger tools. And this brings us back to why we're talking about pricing. Pricing is really a proven tool. We've seen examples from other places where pricing has been proven to reduce trips, is proven to reduce congestion, and provide associated climate benefits and safety benefits. However, as Director Warner sort of started us off with, the question has remained, can it be done in a way that truly makes the system more equitable rather than adding to existing inequities and burdens? And this has really been the central question of this work over the last couple of years. This is why we received direction from Counsel in 2019 to convene the POEM task force and ask, can pricing be a tool that helps not only advance our mobility objectives, advance our carbon emission objectives, but also create a more equitable transportation system. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Emma Sagor, who will talk more about the task force process.
Thanks so much, Shoshana, and good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. We really appreciate the time to address you this morning and bring this exciting work to you. For the record, my name is Emma Sagor. I'm also one of the project managers of the POEM project, and I currently serve as Pbot's strategic performance manager. But for most of the duration of POEM, I actually work with the city as the climate advisor through the Bloomberg Philanthropies American Cities Climate Challenge. And POEM was one of Portland's 6 big climate initiatives that we accelerated with support for the challenge. So it's really been an honor working over the last 2 years with Shoshana and the whole team to help bring this work to fruition. As Shoshana just noted, 2 years ago in 2019, Council directed Pbot and BPS to convene a community task force and explore this really tough question of if and how new pricing could be used in Portland to advance our goals of mobility, climate, and equity. And right after that direction, staff from Pbot and BPS got right to work developing our recruitment strategy for putting together this amazing task force. The Climate Challenge actually also provided funding for a community partner to join our project strategy team, a really innovative model for doing planning and policy work at the city. Originally, that advisor was the great Maria Hernandez Segoviano, who at the time was at Opal Environmental Justice. And then Maria changed roles to a new exciting opportunity. And so Vivian Satterfield with Verde stepped in to join us in that role. You're going to hear a little bit from Vivian in a minute. But with Maria's help and our great team of Pbot and BPS staff, we intentionally designed a strategy to recruit a community task force that represented really diverse perspectives, lived experiences, and professional expertise. But all those applicants had to demonstrate their desire to dive into this conversation focused on equity. And we were really floored with the amount of interest we had. We had over 130 people apply to spend a year and a half with us talking about pricing, which was just astounding. On the screen, you'll see the 19 amazing community leaders and task force members who engaged with us over that entire year and a half. And we really can't say enough about this tremendous group. They volunteered their time, their energy, and their passion during one of the most difficult years we've all lived through. And you're going to hear directly from several of them in just a bit. But I just want to make sure to acknowledge what an awesome group they are and thank them again for their service. So the task force began meeting back in January 2020, and we met monthly from then on. We were super fortunate to have 3 great in-person meetings before the pandemic forced us to switch to Zoom land. And that was really great for building that rapport and that foundation for the work we would embark on together. So to set the scene, before we even started talking about pricing, the group really started with a history lesson and learning about the history of transportation in Portland and why centering racial equity is so critical. Then in March 2020, the group co-developed what we call our Equitable Mobility Framework. And that's the tool that they would use through the rest of the project to analyze different pricing strategies. And I'll share a bit more about that in just a minute. For the remainder of their time together, the task force engaged in what they sometimes joked was graduate level pricing, 401, a very deep dive. They heard from international experts, they read policy briefs, they reviewed high level modeling information, both modeling that we were able to do with some consultant support, but also great modeling work from our friends at Metro, who at the same time as POEM were conducting their regional congestion pricing study. We generally alternated between some big information sharing, technical deep dive meetings, and then giving some space for discussion for the group to really bring their own perspectives and experiences, ask questions, raise new ideas, and really have their space to do what they were asked to do as a task force. And in the end, the group came up with a very thorough and thoughtful list of recommendations, which we're excited to share with you. Much more about that whole process is in our report, which you see on the slide here. So we encourage folks who are interested to deep dive into all those details in that report. But as I mentioned, before the group could really, say, is pricing good for equitable mobility, we had to define what equitable mobility means. It's kind of a wonky mouthful, and it's in the project name, but what does it actually mean? So on the third meeting, and you see some pictures from that great workshop there, we held a working meeting, a workshop to dive into that question and ask, what does equitable mobility in Portland look like? What are the indicators or the outcomes that we most care about or most would need to see to say, yes, we're making our system more equitable? And the task force didn't start this from scratch. They built on a product called the Mobility Equity Framework developed by a group called the Greenlining Institute out of Oakland, a really wonderful equity-focused community organization that has a similar kind of tool that they encourage transportation agencies around the world to use. So the resulting product was a framework with 5 categories that you see here: moving people and goods, sustainability and health, safety, economic opportunity, and also an equitable planning process. And as we went through every pricing idea or pricing strategy, the group would take the technical information they were given, they would take their own thoughts and experiences, and they would ask themselves, what are the opportunities, what are the potential risks, or what are the questions we need to dive into more to think about the outcomes or the impact on all the indicators you see here. So really taking that very holistic view about what pricing could do, not just congestion, not just climate, but really how could it impact our system as a whole. And I think that, while the recommendations are so fabulous coming out of this group, the Equitable Mobility Framework itself is also a product that came from the POEM task force and something that Pbot and other bureaus can really utilize in future work. And I see Commissioner Mapps's hand.
Commissioner Mapps, go ahead.
Thank you for the great presentation so far. I have a question about your equity framework here. I think the obvious question here is, what do we do about low-income folks who need to, get to work or pick up their take their kids to school. And frankly, when I look at these 5 categories, I'm not exactly sure where that class of problem fits in.
Great question, Commissioner Mapps. It's hard to read, I'm sure, but affordability is in there in sort of our moving people and goods, the costs people face in moving themselves, moving their families, moving people, as well as the cost businesses face in moving freight and moving goods around our city. And that affordability element was true, like the number one thing I think that came up in every single conversation, and absolutely a point that the task force addressed right on in their recommendations, kind of a core principle that really we need to design pricing to not burden low-income drivers who are already disproportionately burdened today.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. So as a reminder, Shoshana shared those 5 types of pricing the POEM project considered: parking pricing, fees on vehicle-based commercial services, highway tolling, cordons or area pricing, and road usage or per miles charge. Now, those 5 categories are really very broad, and they run the gamut of different levels of complexity, geographic scales, and also potential impact. As this graphic illustrates, some of our strategies are the types of things that the city itself could implement, has the authority to implement. That's kind of on the bottom part of the matrix. While other strategies have probably a bigger geographic scope where they'll touch pieces of infrastructure we may not own, and they require a regional approach, regional coordination to implement. Furthermore, some strategies can utilize existing technology or regulatory mechanisms. Those are the ones on the left here, while others require infrastructure or new technology that's more complex and maybe would take longer to implement. Those ones are on the right. The nearer term recommendations that you're going to hear about in just a minute that the task force lifted up, they fall more on the things the city could implement, things that build on existing technology and existing regulatory mechanisms. But, we wanted to share this graphic to just, give credit again to the task force for diving into such a big topic with so many different nuances. And also just to reinforce that, in the next phase, there's going to be a lot more deep diving around the specific strategies than we were able to do over the last 18 months. And on that note, talking about the amazing amount of work this group took on, I do want to invite Vivian Satterfield, our amazing community advisor and great partner in this work, to just jump in and share a bit from her perspective about what made this process unique. So Vivian, if you are on, feel free to come off mute.
Thanks so much, Emma. Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm grateful to be here today as part of the POEM presentation. We are finally here this day. I'm Vivian Satterfield, and I work for Today. I was invited early on to apply to become a POEM task force member, and then I participated in these in-person meetings back in 2020, which now feels like a distant memory and really a marker in time for us all now. And then I was asked to join the strategy team through the support and resourcing by the Energy Foundation. And I think that's important to note because there are many who are deeply invested in processes such as POEM, which can tangibly and effectively make an impact on transportation emissions, traffic fatalities, air pollution, and quality of urban life. Those folks recognize that the status quo is harmful, and they value equitable processes that lead to data-driven solutions, and they're rooting for us to succeed in this process. I participated in many public policy-making processes at the city over the past decade as an environmental justice advocate, and I truly have to commend all who are engaged in designing and participating in this process and our collective commitment to centering equity in it. Even with the immense challenge of shifting 80% of the meetings to a solely virtual format as we learn to keep one another safe during the global COVID-19 pandemic, POEM task force members remain actively engaged and intellectually curious. The recommendations that are before you today are the result of the labor and dedication of these community members who showed up every meeting in the evenings with meaningful contributions and engaging in conscientious dialogue with one another. Their time, talents, and energy to sustain this work are inspiring to me. In addition to the attentiveness of the POEM task force members, we had members of the public engaging and submitting written and verbal testimony in support. So we know there are many who may be curious and have been tracking this process and who have been learning alongside us. I came before you all just a few short weeks ago during the anniversary and update of the Climate Emergency Declaration to encourage bolder action on policy levers that can make a meaningful difference on changing the current trajectory that we are on right now, a path of great inequality and great consequence to our climate future. So this, council members, is one of those policy levers that we can activate now. No more than the POEM task force members themselves know how hard this is going to be, and still they reached a place of recommendation which tells us to go and to do this. I do want to take just a moment to recognize that POEM success would have not been possible without the significant contributions of the strategy team that I worked alongside. So I have to brag on them. Thank you so much, Emma Sagor, Shoshana Cohen, Marty Stockton, Ingrid Fish, Michael Espinoza, Mariana Lamato, and Eric Hessa for their partnership and dedication. And I was able to join this team and build on the foundational work of my colleague, Maria Hernandez Segoviano. I'm proud to have contributed to the outcomes, and I look forward to continuing to support this work. I'm going to hand it back over to Shoshana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivian. It has been an honor to work on this project in partnership with you. So now there's been a lot of buildup, and we are ready to begin to share the task force recommendations with you all. And just again, the task force was asked to examine this question of if pricing can be a tool to help advance our objectives. We didn't start with a, we want to do it, how can it be done? But it was more of an if question from the beginning. And because of that, we provided them with information, but then they really took that information, had discussions. And as Vivian just said, these recommendations came from them. This is the task force product. And what that means is that these recommendations are bold, and there are details that as staff, we know that we still need to work through. So we are super excited to share them and excited to be taking this to the next step and then figuring out all of the remaining questions. But we hear their boldness and we want to move forward. And just a little bit more about the vote at the end. In the last meeting, we had 19 task force members, and in the last meeting, 18 of 19 were present. And each of these recommendations that you'll see were actually voted on separately. And for each vote, at least 16 of 18 members present voted in support. So given the nature of the dialogue throughout the 18 months and sort of the complexity of the topics and the varied views that were shared along the way, we really found that this level of consensus by the end was pretty remarkable. So as we share these, again, we're going to share, they've been condensed just a tiny bit for brevity, but we are really trying to share their complete recommendations with you. Again, knowing that they will be hard and there are details we have to work out, but we really hope you will join us in embracing these recommendations and then letting us guide our work moving forward. So the group began with a set of foundational statements. And these are really critical to understanding why they're making the recommendations that they're making. First, there is an urgent need to address the current challenges in our transportation system. We are in a climate crisis. We must also acknowledge our history of disinvestment and harm. And our system today over-prioritizes cars. They then shared what they called principles for pricing for equitable mobility. And really, the central principle is that pricing does hold promise as a strategy to help move people and goods in a more efficient, climate-friendly, and equitable way, but only if designed, implemented, and adjusted with intention. And they then went on to recommend that the city should urgently advance pricing options for equitable mobility policies. We should utilize the equitable mobility framework as we are analyzing and designing specific policies. They also recommended that while this is centered on pricing, we can't do pricing alone. It needs to be done in complement with complementary strategies. It's not a tool by itself that will work. They also, while they said go urgently and do these things and gave us a ton of thought, continued to realize that we also need to continue to do deeper community and stakeholder engagement as we begin to fine tune. And then they had some specific design guidelines, which they suggested that or recommended that we design according to, and they follow. Really, as we are designing specific pricing policies, they said we should be prioritizing reducing miles driven and centering climate inequity outcomes. And this is to say that pricing just designed to raise revenue will not achieve the same outcome. So the design has to be geared towards the policy outcomes, with raising revenue as sort of a complementary benefit, but not the main goal. And then Commissioner Matz, to your question, there's a strong recommendation that for any specific pricing policy, we need to provide low-income exemptions or exemptions for households on low incomes, if at all possible. I think there may be some times when it may not be possible, but if at all possible, that would be the goal. And then in other ways to really dig in on that question of who is being charged and how can we reduce any benefit and consider questions around affordability, or reduce any burden, sorry, and consider affordability questions. They also shared strong recommendations to make sure that we're reducing any unequal burdens around technology and enforcement as we think about how pricing would be implemented. And then recommendations around reinvesting the revenue and using that to further improve equitable mobility strategies, invest in those complementary strategies. And we'll actually share a list of those in a minute. And now Emma's going to get into some of the shorter term strategies.
Thanks, Shoshana. So keeping all of those principles in mind that Shoshana just mentioned, the task force said should apply, regardless the pricing strategy. They then recommended a suite of specific nearer term moves that they think the city should explore and explore further and implement within the next 1 to 3 years. We call these our nearer term strategies. Now, as a reminder, there's going to need to be more work in the next phase to refine these ideas, consider different design parameters, and do more stakeholder engagement. And we're not asking council today to adopt any of these fees, but we really want to lift up the ideas the task force identified as showing the most promise based on their discussion. The first here is a recommendation to create a flexible commuter benefits program. Sometimes this is called a parking cash out program, which would require employers that currently provide free or subsidized parking spaces to their employees to also offer that value, the value of that parking space, either in cash income or in an alternative transportation benefit. There are several examples of a policy like this in California or Washington, D.C. or other places, and they have been proven to have a benefit on reducing driving trips, reducing VMT, and reducing emissions. The next two ideas you see on this list relate to prices on those vehicle-based commercial services, that mouthful that we mentioned before. The task force discussed the rapidly growing miles traveled and miles driven on our roads over the last several years from both urban delivery services like, all the Amazon trucks we're all seeing all over the place, as well as food delivery vehicles, but also TNCs, transportation network companies, which include things like Uber and Lyft. They acknowledge that these services are meeting the needs for many people who have limited options, and they stressed, the importance of really being careful and considering the workforce that support all of these industries. But they recommend that the city explore a fee for urban delivery trips, as well as modifying the existing transportation network company fee structure, which is currently a flat administrative fee, to more explicitly capture the negative mobility, climate, and safety costs and reduce the impacts of these trips. Chicago is a kind of a city that has done things like this in the TNC space. They have a TNC fee structure that's kind of more differentiated around encouraging multi-occupant trips, discouraging trips in places where there's lots of alternatives. On the urban delivery side, this is pretty new and pretty innovative. Chicago and New York have floated some proposals of what this could look like, but they have not yet implemented this type of pricing. In the parking realm, the task force advanced 3 near-term recommendations. The first would be to explore a fee on private off-street parking lots to send price signals and reduce mobility, climate, safety, and equity impacts. Now, this could be designed in a lot of different ways, all of which we'll need to explore in the next phase of work. But the state of Illinois, Seattle, Los Angeles, and some cities in further flung places like Australia have these kinds of taxes or fees in place. The task force also advocated for the city to expand on-street parking permit and meter districts and reduce the complexity required in approving new districts. And finally, the task force recommended that the city accelerate its performance-based parking policy, which is currently adopted policy, and adjust public parking rates based on demand annually. The task force called for assessing where on-street rates might need to be immediately adjusted, as well as establishing a more frequent schedule for price evaluation. And finally, the task force recommended several things related to state-led pricing discussions, those things on that matrix that are kind of not things the city would implement, but places where we are an involved stakeholder. They would like the city to advocate for amending the Oregon state constitutional restriction that currently limits the use of funds generated through taxes on motor vehicles and limits this expenditure of that money on right-of-way improvements or infrastructure improvements. And they also want the city to champion the principles that Shoshana discussed in state-led tolling and road usage charge conversations, which I can speak to more on my next slide, but I'll
Emma,
pause here for,
yeah, before you move on, Commissioner Ryan has a comment or a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Shoshana, this is a great presentation, and thank you, Emma. It's the second time this has entered my brain, and it's when you mention urban delivery, you mention Uber, Lyft, you mention Amazon, and I keep thinking about the large, the big long haulers, the big freight that goes through our city. Is that included in this category?
That's a great question, Commissioner Ryan. What we were really talking about was when we said vehicle-based commercial services, what are those trips that are adding miles to our local system? But thinking of the implications for longer haul freight is definitely a critical thing. And we think about those strategies that might touch our bigger infrastructure, might touch highway tolling or potential road usage charging. Absolutely, kind of thinking about the moving goods impacts is definitely something we discussed. But I think for the things you see on this nearer term list, it was more that more on demand, the real meteoric rise we've seen in those on demand or last mile kind of order it now, get it in 3 hours trips that we're really seeing quite a large rise in VMT. Shoshana, is there anything you'd add there?
No, I think that's it. I think, as Emma said, in some of the strategies that are on our next slide, and in the longer term, we know there's a lot of interest from the freight community, and also in dealing with congestion and helping to move goods more easily. I think there's interest and there's trepidation, interest in easing congestion, but also concern about paying more. So, but it is in sort of those bigger strategies, whether on highways or, if we were to move towards something more like a central city scheme in the future, which again, all of that is farther out.
Sure. And you mentioned the influence of the local. Were the people at the table, the task force, was there anyone included from such large freight haulers? Were they part of the task force? Was there anyone representative from that group?
We had someone who was associated with some freight movement who actually is one of the people who left after a couple of months. We did not lose many people, but we did lose one freight person. So we did as Emma said, when we set this up, because the focus was really on equity and community, we focused largely on community and equity perspectives, and there was a variety of them, and we did have different business perspectives, but we also didn't do sometimes Pbot or in city communities, we're sort of like, we need 2 people in this category and 2 people in this category and 2 people in this category, and sort of make sure that we checked all the boxes. And we took a little bit of a different approach. So that's part of the work now moving forward. We know that there are stakeholders who weren't at the table that we have to continue to talk to.
Thank you. Thanks, Shoshana.
So just to share a little bit more about the task force's specific recommendations around tolling. In addition to the recommendations they adopted in July, they also voted back in March of this year to adopt a letter to city leadership with some specific principles they wanted the city to advocate for in ongoing state-led conversations about tolling. And they kind of expedited this just because those are ongoing conversations and we're at that table frequently. These principles that you see here are very consistent with the final principles that Shoshana mentioned, prioritizing reducing miles driven, exemptions for drivers living on low incomes, reducing barriers of technology technology and payment. And then they specifically called for, pushing to commit toll revenue to support multimodal alternatives and mitigate diversion, as well as really involving local and regional stakeholders in revenue allocation decisions related to tolling.
Commissioner Hardesty has her hand raised.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Emma. I just wanted to, at this point, share that the state use of the word tolling is disconcerting because it is not what I know to be tolling from growing up on the East Coast and always having tolls. So we believe congestion pricing is a better terminology because it provides more options. So I just wanted my colleagues to know that that at least at the state level, tolling and congestion pricing is being used interchangeably. And in my mind, they are not the same. And so we're going to be continuing to advocate that we use the right terminology. Thanks, Emma and Shoshana.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you for bringing that up. I really should have put it on this slide. I believe that was also a recommendation from the task force, was to push ODOT to call it congestion pricing. So thank you for your championing of that recommendation. So we just have a couple more slides and then you'll get to hear from our task force members directly. But in addition to those nearer term moves, there were also 3 strategies that the task force acknowledged may take longer to develop. Think back to that matrix. They're more on the it's going to take new technology, or it's going to take more regional collaboration. But they said they warrant further planning, thinking, and analysis because they do have potential for some system-wide benefits. They include more truly dynamic demand-based parking where rates could change based on kind of real-time occupancy rates. The second one was a locally controlled road usage charge. Now, the state is currently looking at a road usage charge primarily as a tool to replace the gas tax. But the task force felt the city should advocate, both that state road usage charge be designed to advance our policy goals, but also that the city explore maybe its own road usage charge that could layer on top and be designed to align with those POEM principles. And finally, the task force said the city should keep considering the potential of a central city cordon. This is kind of the London style, you have a price around your sort of downtown core. Especially because that's the area of our city that has the most multimodal options today. But they didn't recommend this as highly. There were some initial modeling results that showed, based on the way that our highways curl around our city, and it may just not be the tool that delivers the benefits we need to see. So they said, keep thinking about it. We're not ready yet to say it's our top choice. This is a kind of long and very beautiful laundry list of those complementary strategies Shoshana mentioned. The task force was very clear that pricing should not be done in a vacuum. It needs to be done in concert and alongside other multimodal and system investments, and it should also be used to invest in those things. But this list shows the ideas that came up in so many of our conversations. Number 1, public transit infrastructure and service and operations, bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure and programs, safety improvements, incentives and financial support, sort of the other side of the pricing coin, the carrot to the stick. Strategies that help with fuel shifting. Again, Shoshana mentioned, we know people will always have to drive, so the trips that remain on our roads really need to be powered by clean fuels. And we talked a lot about the nexus between housing and transportation and land use policy, and they really wanted to elevate that here as well. And finally, the task force was very clear that, when we think about support for low-income folks, and as I said, exemptions is really the top priority, but it's really important to be providing direct financial support to Portlanders living on low incomes and trusting community members to make the decisions that best benefit them whenever we can. And so finally, the group concluded their recommendations with some process next steps they'd like to see us take. Number 1, they said, be bold, Portland, take a leadership role, really seize this moment and move with the urgency it requires. But they said, do it thoughtfully, do it thoroughly. They want us to commit to using data to really analyze and evaluate equity, all those indicators on that framework, really make sure we're doing our homework and we're evaluating both before and after we implement anything. That also means studying the impacts of COVID-19, which is changing our mobility system, and really monitoring that and considering that as we move forward. They recognized the need for more community engagement. This was a deep dive with a small group. In the next phase, we need to broaden the net and do more stakeholder outreach. And finally, the task force said, as we get more serious about pricing, we also need to explore models for a unified financial assistance system that reduces the burden on households living on low income. So you don't have to apply for one discount over here, one exemption over here, this honored citizen program. Let's really think about how we can reduce that on the back end and make this easier for folks who are already experiencing challenges. So I'll leave it to Shoshana to wrap us up.
All right, thank you all. So the resolution then before you directs Pbot and BPS to continue this work, to use the POEM principles to take the strategies to the next stage and develop actual implementation plans for nearer term pricing strategies as well as complementary strategies. And as part of that work, we know that we'll have to do additional stakeholder engagement, research, data collection, impact analysis, and then really get into the policy design for each of those specific strategies. The resolution also directs us to do further analysis on the longer term strategies. Again, we know that those are not ready right now, but we do want to continue to consider them, as well as to continue to advocate for pricing for equitable mobility principles in the ongoing state-led conversations. And then while we know we have more work to do, we also heard the sort of continued requests for urgency and for doing something from the task force. So the resolution directs us to do this work and return within 9 months, not, take another couple of years and think about this, but return within 9 months with more specific policy proposals and updates at that time. And at this point, we have we have a few of our task force members here to speak a little bit briefly themselves, but I don't know if there's other questions before we switch to them, or if we should just keep going.
Not seeing any. Go ahead and let's hear from the task force members. We're grateful that they're here.
All right. I will just call a couple of you, and I think I know we had a couple who had to leave, but I think Hal Hagedorn and then Sarah Wright and then Tony Jordan we'll start off with.
Great. So hopefully you can hear me. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Hal Hagedorn. I served as a member of the POEM task force. I'll try to keep my comments brief. So having served on many transportation committees over the past 25 years as a transportation professional, oftentimes I question the value or utility of serving on these committees. This experience, however, was much different. Thanks to Shoshana, Emma, and the Pbot and BPS team for leading this effort. The recommendations in the report accurately reflect the input of our committee, and it includes the diversity of voices that Portland needs to ensure that mobility options moving forward are equitable. And I know that the city's motto is the city that works, but it seems like it's also a city that loves to create plans. And so this is yet another ambitious plan that will not only require working across bureaus, but outside Portland's jurisdictional and political boundaries. But I do believe this is what is needed in order to make any progress towards mobility and climate justice and safety. And to make sure that the plan just doesn't sit on a shelf, there are some near-term actions that the city can move forward quickly on. And many of these relate to parking and mobility-based services. I urge the city to move on these strategies that will help be the catalyst our region needs to move more ambitious actions forward. Thank you for this opportunity to share my input.
Thank you.
Sarah?
Mayor and Commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Sarah Wright, Transportation Program Director at Oregon Environmental Council and member of the POEM Task Force. OEC is proud to have participated in POEM, and we're thrilled to see the recommendations moving forward. And I also want to just pile on to the appreciations that you've already heard for the thoughtful and thorough work of Pbot and BPS staff on this project. As you know, our transportation system is responsible for nearly 40% of greenhouse gas emissions statewide and places heavy externalized costs on our communities in the form of air toxics, traffic violence, and more. Furthermore, by focusing on accommodating private vehicles in our public right-of-way, the status quo marginalizes the convenience, mobility, and safety of people who do not have access to private cars. These recommendations offer a path forward to a better system that is safe, convenient, efficient, affordable, and accessible for everyone, and does not create externalized costs in air pollution and exacerbating the climate crisis. By pricing transportation choices that externalize costs on our community, we can allow people to continue to choose to use a private vehicle to get around and have a less congested and more reliable driving experience, and turn that convenience into money that can be invested into creating better choices for everyone. Oregon Environmental Council urges you to move forward with these recommendations as quickly and robustly as possible. We need bold action to break away from the destructive status quo and reach for a better system. Thank you very much.
Tony.
Good morning, Mayor Wheeler and commissioners. My name is Tony Jordan. I also served on the POEM task force. I want to thank my fellow committee members and the city staff and their partners for providing what was really an exceptional committee experience. This process was transparent and respectful of our time and concerns. And I think the high rate of attendance during truly difficult times and the near unanimous consensus for the recommendations speaks to the quality of this process. I also believe that the attendance and support from the task force members speaks to the seriousness and urgency of the moment we're in. If we're being honest, these are policies that we could have and should have been implemented 20 years ago. The impact of car dependency and congestion on climate, public health, and our ability to provide equitable access and abundant housing in our city is not disputed. Some of these policies will be easier than others, but there are working examples of most of them in peer cities around the country and world. And so I hope we can borrow as much as possible, improve on it a bit, and get moving because we don't have time for any other approach. The recommendations are heavy on parking, and I understand that not everyone is as excited about that as I am, but I do want to stress that the reason parking pricing is so prominent is it's one of the few levers the city can pull on its own to both change behavior and raise revenue, and most importantly, reinvest that revenue in the community in ways that further reduce car dependency and congestion. And I want to emphasize the committee's recommendations on how to mitigate the impact of pricing on BIPOC communities, low-income households, and people with disabilities through a unified program. This is something that's too important to be reinvented and shoehorned into every individual program. The city must develop system-wide programs to subsidize transit and other modes. Even better, the city should develop something like a Pbot program where cash is sent to low-income households to be used how they see fit, be it paying parking fees or paying for childcare or paying for rent at a place that's closer to work. But truly, any form of tiered pricing that works is inherently more equitable than the status quo. Time spent in traffic, whether in a car or on the bus, is an unproductive burden, and environmental impacts are borne inequitably in our community. If these strategies return time, cleaner air, and a more stable climate to low-income households, then that is a great benefit on its own. And finally, I want to echo my net meter revenue testimony and urge you to commit some current downtown meter revenues to expanding the transportation wallet program citywide before these new strategies come to council, because that will make the whole process much easier and more equitable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a few more. Esme, Adi, Stephanie, and then Aaron.
Commissioners, I thank you for considering today's resolution. I would like you to consider it from a larger perspective than merely transportation equity, larger even than the urgent social transformations that are needed to even begin to address climate change. I speak today from the background of my historical training and my years as an affordable housing advocate. We meet today at the end of 30 years in which the city has managed its growth by not just figuratively, but literally marginalizing, pushing to the margins, anyone not protected by money or property ownership. The housing, land use, and transportation systems that we have reliably produce two things: social exclusion and carbon emissions. We operate under two malign visions of the city. First, the settler colonial mindset that values the city as property, but sees community as expendable. And second, the addictive haze of fossil fuel dependency that mistakes the private vehicle for social personhood, that beholds the heart of our culture and economy and perceives an obstacle to high-speed travel. We cannot solve for climate without solving for equity. Creating exclusive green communities only shifts carbon emissions to those thrown beyond the pale. We cannot solve for equity without solving for climate. The demands of private vehicle storage and travel make impossible truly inclusive forms of urban housing and truly heterogeneous neighborhoods. The pricing strategies outlined in the task force report would spark a vast reconsideration of thoughtless motor vehicle trips, but they are not perfect. The more skeptical members of our task force feared that any policy that generates revenue will simply be redirected to benefit the rich and the powerful. And we face consequences of years of displacement as well. Many BIPOC and lower income Portlanders now live in neighborhoods that aren't well served by transit. But the twin equity and climate challenges we face are urgent. With income-based exemptions and with transformational reinvestment of pricing revenues, the policies outlined in the report provide an avenue to meet those challenges and move us closer to the vision of an inclusive, sustainable city. Thank you.
80. Hello, everyone. My name is Adi Leverett, and I'm here on behalf of Business for a Better Portland and as a member of the POEM Task Force. Mr. Mayor, commissioners, I don't know about you, but I've been in quite a few Zoom rooms over the past 18 months, and I'd like to tell you that the team that coordinated this task force deserves some sort of Portland Peace Prize for the way that they were able to create such a seamless, adaptable, emotionally intelligent, technically educational, and diplomatically productive process to tackle one of the thorniest and intransigent policy areas that we face while, there was kind of a lot going on in the world. So by the end of it, what really struck me was not only the quality of the public servants that we have working to make our city a better place, but what an incredible resource the city has in the willingness of so many of its people to contribute their time, expertise, and experience to advance the vision of a better Portland. And while civic engagement can at times be frustrating and disappointing work, this task force is a great example of how effective and meaningful it can be. And while the pandemic made this work more difficult in some ways, it gave us some invaluable advantages. A stark example of how possible it is to quickly make big changes, and an even greater sense of urgency to address inequity in all the subtle, complex, and insidious ways that it manifests in our society. So will it be easy to advance these recommendations? Of course not. We're stretched thin across myriad crises, and in these dynamic times, the status quo has a paradoxical allure. But is it possible to make these changes that will move us toward the transportation system that we simply must have in order for an equitable economy to grow and thrive in the future? Yes, it's not only possible, but it's imperative. Thank you.
Stephanie? Good morning, Mayor Wheeler and commissioners. My name is Stephanie Frederick. I'm grateful to have been part of the POEM Task Force. I'm nervous, so I'll calm down here. So to call out a reality we kept in mind, we car owners, I'm one, don't pay anywhere near the full cost of the driving we do. A few examples: we don't pay for the asthma and other illnesses we inflict on exploited people trapped in housing along freeways and busy streets. We don't pay for our role in the climate crisis that is most injurious to the most vulnerable amongst us. We don't pay for noise harm or economic losses due to congestion. It's no wonder we're out there in droves doing damage. Local government can't eliminate the subsidies that distort the market in favor of vehicle and fuel industries. And we can't make the big financial markets capture the invisible, such as the medical costs of ozone-brittle lungs. But local government can undo some of the pricing distortion and thus some of the harm at the city level. We can do that by having us drivers face higher driving costs and thus pay for some of the damage we do, or reduce that damage by changing the way we travel. Our task force recommended looking at parking early on because the cost of parking is a huge determinant of driving behavior. At the same time, we were mindful not to burden our vulnerable populations that struggle for equitable transportation. They are not the ones causing harm. Our task force has suggested many additional actions to head us into a saner, more equitable transportation future. For that future, please approve the resolution before you today. Thank you.
And Aaron.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me be last. There's a lot of pressure there now. So I represent, I'm a business owner. I'm on several business forums in town, and I entered this, being passionate about this subject.
Would you put your name on the record for the public record, please?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Aaron Grimmer, business owner and member of the task force. Thank you. So I came in passionate about this, but the obvious thing representing a business community is like, well, all of these recommendations at what expense, right? At like what will this cost my business and my future? And I really want to echo the sentiments of the other task force members, Emma and Shoshana and their team. Really did a great job converting me. I learned a lot about the history of our city. I learned a lot firsthand from other members of the task force of what it's like to be a member of these marginalized communities, to not have access to safe public transit, to not have the same access that I do. I've also learned from my employees and what it's like every year to see them moving farther and farther out of the core, central part of the city, and their commute times have gone from 45 minutes to an hour and a half to longer. And at the end of all of this, I've just realized that this is not at the expense of the business community, these recommended changes, but these are necessary to our success. They're necessary to the success of our city on an economic level and environmental level, when the least and most marginalized and most overlooked of us are considered and supported and given access. Then we all succeed from the very top and from every sector in our community, and especially the business community. But I know that this is a challenge, not so much in conflict of interest, but in a conflict in messaging. And I want to say, on behalf of, my efforts, that I think that the challenge really is to help others in the business community to understand that basic concept, that through these changes, we will see a more prosperous, more successful, and we will really be a beacon of a city that others can look to for how these changes can create a real positive and lasting change in our environment, on our community, and on those that have been so marginalized and overlooked over the entire history of our city. So I encourage you to adopt this resolution, and I look forward to continuing to support and participate in this effort to make real change. And again, thank you to the task force leaders and everything you guys have done. I know it's not been easy, and thank you very much.
Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks to all the speakers. But Aaron, you inspired me to ask, how are you going to help me sell this to businesses as good for their bottom line? I love the fact that you exposed yourself as converted to this vision of a more equitable, climate-friendly, climate-resilient, and more just city. How are you going to help me sell this to everybody else?
Commissioner, let me know when you're ready to speak. I'm a member of an Oregon Business Forum, which we anxiously and are actively looking for speakers all the time to come and meet with us. I would love to have you there, perhaps some other members of our task force, and really kind of convey that message. I know it's a difficult one to get, and there's a lot of questions there, but I think that is where the work needs to be done.
I agree with you 100%. I'm on. Let me know when, because you're absolutely right. We're not doing something to people, right? We're inviting people to join us and actually fixing our climate so that our children and grandchildren will actually have a planet that they will inherit from us. So I really appreciate you stepping up, and I love the fact that you've been a convert now. I know Tony had a lot to do with that. I'm pretty sure, but thank you for your work.
No, thank you.
Thank you. And does that then complete the presentation?
Yes.
Very good. Keelan, let me ask you at this point, since I don't see any immediate comments or questions from my colleagues, do we have anybody signed up to testify on the resolution?
We do, Mayor. We have 13 people signed up.
Okay. 2 minutes each, please. Name for the record.
Okay, I will call them three at a time. First up, we have Victoria Paykar, Elizabeth Stamp, and Paxton Rothwell. Go ahead, Victoria, whenever you're ready.
Hi, good morning. Sorry, just shifting Zoom here as a panelist. Good morning, Mayor. Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Victoria Paykar, and I am the Oregon Transportation Policy Manager at Climate Solutions. And I'm here this morning to testify in support of the POEM Task Force adopted recommendations. And these specific, equitable, and intentional pricing recommendations are important to our communities because they have the potential to structurally transform our transportation system to one that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, reduces the need to drive, is people-centered, and ensure transportation access is available for all. While many of us think of moving goods and services when we think of transportation, when you look at the root of it, transportation is about access. And so transportation has the opportunity to create thriving communities by ensuring folks have access to basic necessities such as healthcare, education, jobs, green spaces, grocery stores, and more. So when we're dealing with transportation issues, we're dealing with a duty to provide a basic human right. And as you know, our transportation system is not only the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our region, but it's also highly inequitable. And our transportation system determines who does and who does not have access to the essential services I mentioned earlier, and also who gets the brunt of the negative consequences of transportation. So air pollution, displacement, gentrification, and even lost lives. And unfortunately, the design of our transportation system was often intentional, and those with inequitable access and those bearing the burden of negative impacts of racist and classist transportation planning decisions today are disproportionately low-income communities and communities of color. And the good news is that since we purposely design inequitable cities, we also have the potential to intentionally design cities that are people-centered, equitable, and puts the welfare of our people and planet first. So at the end of the day, we have this urgent need to improve the transportation system and address its rotted structures that face. We need innovative and paradigm-shifting transportation policies that are people-centered and works to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If we try to adopt transportation policies that we know don't fix problems like widening or adding lanes, where at its core, it's not meant to disrupt the structural problems of how we do transportation, we'll only be putting bandages on an inequitable and broken system for the rest of our lives. So I hope that you will support the POEM Task Force recommendations, and thank you so much for listening to my comments.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Elizabeth Stamp.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm Elizabeth Stamp with NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. NRDC is in strong support of the POEM Task Force resolution now before you. We urge its passage and rapid implementation. Many American cities are now moving forward on road pricing programs to combat climate change and traffic congestion, clean up the air, address longstanding inequities, and expand and improve transportation options for all residents. Portland is among the cohort of leading cities in the American Cities Climate Challenge, which NRDC supports. And with this project, Portland has emerged as a model for thoughtful stakeholder engagement that centers equity. We applaud the dedication and hard work of Portland's POEM Task Force to develop these recommendations, as well as their eloquent and moving comments today. NRDC supports all the recommended strategies, and we urge you to begin passing policies to implement them in the coming months. Failure to act will exacerbate the climate crisis and the deep inequities in today's transportation system, which affect people's lives every day. We urge swift action to realize the many potential benefits of the task force's work. As we heard the task force said, be bold, Portland. Cities across the nation are looking to you to lead. Thank you.
Next up, we have Paxton Rothwell.
Good morning, Commissioners and Mayor Wheeler. My name is Paxton Rothwell, and I'm here speaking on behalf of Sunrise PDX. It raises my spirit today to speak in support of the recommendations put forth by the POEM Task Force. The illusion of free driving is a myth. All things have costs. Acres of asphalt and lens contributed to the deadly urban heat island effect that raised the air temperature to 124 degrees during the heat wave in June. Unpaid parking incentivizes driving to locations that could be accessed by transit, bike, or on foot. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans have navigated this world without the use of the car. But in the last 100, we have transformed every single aspect of our transportation system to accommodate the speedy movement of everyone's personal space-hogging box. We chuck grocery stores and other crucial access locations behind vast seas of asphalt. We bulldoze the poorest communities to build interstates. We even walled off the east side of the Willamette with 6 lanes of high-speed noise and pollution. On a daily basis, we see these reminders that generations of leaders and planners have prioritized the movement and storage of the car above the health and well-being of the person. This inequity has to stop. While it's hard to reimagine or repurpose infrastructure, policy can be used to leverage what we have to fund what we deserve. By changing the ways we think about mobility in the city, we can improve the safety of our streets, lower emissions, and stitch back communities that have been ripped apart by decades of car-oriented decisions. You can start today by moving these recommendations forward so that tomorrow, city bureaus can start advancing programs that would charge for all aspects of car use within Portland. I urge you to then invest these funds from drivers in protected bike infrastructure, pedestrianized streets, and more transit space. The city also needs to heavily lobby TriMet to improve connectivity, frequency, and reliability of its bus system. Nowhere in the city is there an illuminated sign that reads "Go by car," but without the POEM recommendations being put in place quickly, city policy will still read just that. We deserve equitable mobility policy just as much as we deserve a livable future. Please support these recommendations. Thank you very much for your time.
Next up, we have Owen Christofferson, Andre Lightsey Walker, and Anna Kemper.
Good morning, commissioners and mayor. My name is Owen Christofferson. I'm a longtime Uber and Lyft driver, PSU grad student, and current chair of the Pbot TNC Advisory Committee. I'm speaking today in support of POEM. TNCs such as Uber and Lyft are rife with environmental, worker equity, and racial justice concerns, but I believe that within the framework, we can begin to tackle these issues simultaneously. Now, things may be a little different right now, but in non-pandemic times, our streets were flooded with Uber and Lyft drivers, each one trying to earn a living with their vehicle, much of the time driving around empty, looking for a ride. In fact, a 2019 report from Uber and Lyft found almost 40% of driver miles are without a passenger. This system benefits the TNCs since they don't pay drivers unless they're actively in a ride, and it benefits customers who are now used to a TNC vehicle being just minutes away. But who loses? The environment, as much of these emissions are simply unnecessary, and of course the congestion impacts are substantial, but also the drivers who, with no limit on the number of vehicles allowed, face low, even sub-minimum wages when accounting for expenses, as well as a precarious work environment with none of the labor protections afforded to employee classified workers. Worker equity issues in the TNC sector are also racial justice issues. Although local statistics are limited, the city of Seattle found that 72% of drivers are immigrants, 50% are Black. We cannot leave these workers behind. One solution is simply paying drivers for the time they are driving without a passenger, operationally referred to as period 1. This not only incentivizes TNCs not to flood the road with vehicles, but coupled with a broader standard of minimum compensation, provides living wages for drivers and pays them for all of the time they work. I hope that we can work together to further the environmental, racial, and worker justice issues in the TNC and for hire sectors that are so central to the POEM plan. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have, Andre Lightsey Walker.
Good morning, Mayor Wheeler and commissioners. My name is Andre Lightsey Walker. I'm a 4th generation Portlander, graduate of Irvington Elementary, Grant High School, and Portland State University. And I'm here today as the Policy Transformation Manager at the Street Trust. I want to quickly commend the task force and Pbot staff for not only their innovative outcomes, but the processes that led to them. The Street Trust supports the POEM task force recommendations and encourages City Council to formally adopt these recommendations with quick and thoughtful movement towards an implementation plan. You all have the opportunity to set precedent at a pivotal point in the region's history, where conversations of pricing are coming up at local, regional, and state levels. Let's work together to reestablish Portland as a global transportation leader and use our influence and successes as a model for how urban areas can do pricing right. I ask that as you work towards implementation, you remember to prioritize changing travel behavior, not generating revenue. Revenue should only be looked at as an opportunity and a tool to double down on your impact, using funds generated to continue to help reduce demand and improve equitable outcome in our transportation system. People will be angered by the prospect of paying for something they've cognitively established as free, whether it's plastic bags, parking in their neighborhood, or crossing a bridge. An adverse response to this change is expected. However, as leaders in our community, you have the unique responsibility of helping people understand that the things they perceived as free have actually been quite costly, causing generations of harm to our environment, health, and our most vulnerable communities. And that our current systems will continue to do so without urgent, strategic, and innovative intervention. I ask for your continued leadership as we move forward in showing Portland and beyond that designing streets for people is justice in action. Thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Next up, we have Anna Kemper.
All right. Good morning, Commissioners and Mayor Wheeler. My name is Anna Kemper, and I'm here today as the new Policy and Engagement Coordinator on behalf of Business for a Better Portland. I'm excited to speak in favor of the recommendations put forward by the task force and encourage the city to move quickly and efficiently in implementing these long overdue and important changes. The work conducted by the task force was led by a diverse group of community advocates and leaders, and this group believes in a vision everyone present here today could agree on: a walkable, safe, sustainable Portland that is accessible for all of our neighbors. Transportation has been a focus of Business for a Better Portland and the members we represent since the founding of our organization, because we know efficient and equitable mobility is a key factor to a thriving, healthy city and is critical in combating the climate crisis in a big way. The hidden costs of cars and trucks on the road, such as climate and health impacts, traffic deaths, they impact all of us, but disproportionately impact BIPOC and low-income communities. An essential component to the task force's work was to examine the range of pricing options that we heard about earlier and evaluate them for their ability to provide equitable options for all of our neighbors. Pricing options that disproportionately impact BIPOC communities and other marginalized groups hurt the communities who are currently being burdened by issues in our current transportation systems. Business for a Better Portland's diverse coalition of members represent the businesses that make Portland strong. And I'm really excited to represent this group of business owners who understand that pricing on transportation is essential to a just and healthy future for everyone. Approving the task force recommendations today is the easy part. Complex problems require innovative implementation, and actual effective execution and program design of these recommendations will require political will and thoughtful coordination. The recommendations by the POEM Task Force represent an incredible opportunity for Portland to be a leader in transportation justice. As city staff stated in their presentation earlier, swift implementation is critical for a climate-safe future. And as city leaders, it is now your responsibility to implement the bold changes that we need to see. Thank you.
Next up, we have Ariadna, Falcon Gonzalez, Franklin Jones, and Doug Claus.
Hello, thank you for having me. Good morning, commissioners and mayor. My name is Ariadna. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Getting There Together Coalition Manager. The Getting There Together Coalition, GTT, was formed in 2017 as a multicultural, multi-generational coalition that centers and uplifts the voices and needs of people most impacted by transportation inequities through education, advocacy, access, and leadership. We envision a world where Black, Indigenous, people of color, youth, people with disability, older adults, and low-income communities have meaningful participation in the creation of an accessible, affordable, equitable, and climate-friendly transportation system. Our current transportation system is broken and needs immediate attention before it fails us all. GTT believes it's important that community and elected leaders are critically aware that the over-prioritization of cars goes hand in hand with the underfunding and disinvestments that disproportionately harm BIPOC, low income, and people who do not have the physical or legal ability to drive. GTT supports POEM's principles and the Equitable Mobility Framework, which reflects the importance of advancing options while not neglecting mechanisms that create more equitable and sustainable mobility infrastructures. The City of Portland's commitment and pursuit of racial equity and transportation should mirror POEM's process of investing in equitable pricing. We urge that the staff of the City of Portland look for ways to engage the coalition in the implementation of the POEM recommendations. GTT is BIPOC-led and works to advance equitable transportation policies. The communities of the organizations and businesses that make up GTT are diverse and powerful in their experiences and their backgrounds. Thank you all. GTT is proud to support the POEM recommendations and looks forward to the implementation plan.
Next up, we have Franklin Jones. Franklin, are you able to unmute?
Yes.
Yeah, there we go.
Hello, commissioners and Mayor Wheeler, and thank you very much for the opportunity to provide testimony in support of the report on pricing options from Equitable Mobility. My name is Franklin Jones. I am the founder and CEO of Beeline Urban Delivery. Beeline Urban Delivery is best known for our sustainable last mile delivery services, which utilize large e-assisted cargo tricycles to deliver goods throughout the city. And in fact, since 2010, Beeline has worked closely with Office Depot Office Max for delivery of office products to the city of Portland, as well as Portland State University. Today, I'm here to provide testimony in support of the continued efforts of the city to closely look at transportation systems and recommend pricing options for mobility, especially in terms of our freight and delivery systems and the impact those systems have on all of our neighborhoods. The POEM's report's recommendations point to the urgent and important need to address both the climate crisis and inequality of our transportation systems. As a small business owner in the last mile delivery sector, the recommendations for reducing driving, shifting trip modes, and planning and building connected transportation networks align with our mission and vision of creating a more livable community for all. However, key to this report is the acknowledgement and articulation that the recommended pricing strategies need further analysis. And not unlike the transportation system itself, the strategies to implement true change need not to be one size fits all, but rather carefully crafted implementation that uses the right tools for the job. This is Beeline's approach, and I would support council to move forward with a recommendation for POEM and further study. I do so because I believe that this will open the door to innovative solutions that may break down the inequalities and push us to a more climate-friendly future. And Beeline looks forward to participating in that future. Thank you, everyone, again.
Next up is Doug Claus.
Hi, Mayor Wheeler and Commissioners. My name is Doug Claus. Although I am a registered lobbyist with Portland Neighbors Welcome, I'm speaking today for myself only. But as Esme Miller pointed out, there is definitely a housing connection, and hopefully we need to bring all those factors together. As well as that, I was on the Pedestrian Advisory Committee for 20 years and also co-founded Oregon Walks, and all these things are now coming together in toward the same goal. I support the pricing options for Equitable Mobility Plan. This will reduce carbon emissions, reduce congestion, and make our transportation system more equitable by reducing the disparate impacts on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, low income, and disabled people. I support all the recommendations of the plan, but especially the unified financial assistance system, would potentially in the form of cash payments, which would mitigate impacts of pricing strategies on low-income households. This is a key feature of making this an equitable plan, and I urge you to adopt this resolution, and we can get the work being done to further implement this. Thank you.
Next up, we have Indigo Namkung, Sean Sweat, and Kathy Tuttle.
Hi, folks. Good morning, commissioners, and thank you for having me. My name is Indy Nyamkun. I'm the coalition manager at 350 PDX, and I'm here to testify in support of the POEM Task Force recommendations before you today. While we're thrilled to be making progress as a city and a state towards solutions like grid and building electrification, the transportation sector is still responsible for more than 40% of our city's greenhouse gas emissions. This means that we cannot meet our climate goals without also rapidly decarbonizing our transportation system. In this process, we must also take care not to reproduce the inequities in power and burdens that have created our present situation. I'm calling in today from the Albina neighborhood where just about 50 years ago, hundreds of Black homes and businesses were bulldozed to build freeways, so this history is top of mind. Today, BIPOC, low-income folks, and disabled folks in Portland are still bearing the heaviest burdens of our current transportation system, including climate impacts like extreme heat and weather, air toxics, unsafe streets and sidewalks, and more. We can't afford to delay addressing these problems. We can't ignore that they are part of a larger history of injustice, and we must confront the fact that our existing strategies are not making the necessary progress. Dramatically reducing our driving and electrifying the vehicles that must remain are the bare minimum required to address carbon emissions alone. And I don't think it's too radical to say that Portland deserves better than the bare minimum. The POEM recommendations offer us a roadmap to achieving more, to build complete neighborhoods for all, rich in food, resources, and connection, to add hours spent commuting back to our days, to breathe cleaner air, and to walk, bike, move, and play on safer streets and sidewalks. And finally, to begin to correct the historical injustices that have kept these things out of reach for many BIPOC, low-income, and disabled Portlanders. For this reason, commissioners, I'm urging you to accept these recommendations and to direct the bureaus to begin planning for implementation as soon as possible. I also strongly encourage you to ensure these bureaus are well-resourced, both to support this work moving forward at a pace that matches the urgency of the moment, and to keep Portland's most impacted communities truly centered in ongoing decision-making, as described in the Equitable Mobility Framework. We all win when the people closest to the problem lead on the solution. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Next up, we have Sean Sweat.
Hello, thank you. This is Sean Sweat. I'm a resident of Portland. I ride a bike, I take transit, and I also drive a car, but I think it needs to be harder for me to drive and easier to bike and use transit. Safer, of course, but also just easier. There's really 3 points I wanted to hit. The first one was about the value and necessity of our leadership, but I'm on this issue, but I'm just going to skip over that because I think all the speakers before me have already hit that really well. So the second thing is I wanted to just encourage us not to rely too heavily on electric vehicles. I think I saw in one of the graphics a triangle, and electric clean energy and electric vehicles are down on the right side of it. But if you peek behind the curtain there at the upstream supply chains of those, they're really not very clean. So are they better than combustion engines? Definitely for the area they're in. For other regions where they're actually sourced from, maybe not. So I really would encourage us to focus on designing our city to prioritize bikes and transit, not rely on electric vehicles like I feel like a lot of people are hoping for electric vehicles to be a panacea, because I think a lot of people look to that and think, oh, look, we can solve the problem without actually changing anything about how we live. And that's just not the fact. So prioritizing bikes and transit doesn't mean just make room for them, but to actually put them ahead of cars in all our street and building design. So I just encourage us to focus on that over electric vehicles. And lastly, I do support this program, but I also think it's moving it's moving too slowly. It's already taken us too long to get to this point today. And 9 months more is simply time we don't have in a climate crisis. So I please approve this resolution today, but I would also ask that you maybe think about accelerating it, because the climate disasters are escalating quickly. And if we don't move faster, I just think we lose. Thanks.
Next, we have Kathy Tuttle.
Hi, Mayor and Commissioners. This is Kathy Tuttle. I'm a new resident in the Pearl District. I moved here actually because of the Portland Clean Energy Fund. I'm studying that, and it's a fabulous program. I moved here from Seattle, and I think it's a program that we could export back to Seattle. And this set of recommendations from the POEM task force is just as meaningful and just as impactful, or it will be, as that Portland Clean Energy Fund, I think, in the long term. I think they both address the same kinds of issues. And I'm very impressed both with the PCEF and with the POEM task force at the process that they've gone through to reach the recommendations. I strongly support it. I think it's incredibly thoughtful and meaningful. I have one small caveat, which is, I think, actually echoing the previous speaker, that it needs to go faster. And then the other thing is I looked at the Way to Go plan and the appendices, and there was no mention of the bicycle master plan, the 2030 bicycle master plan, in either the plan or the appendices. If you don't call it out, if you don't measure it, if you don't push for it, it's not going to happen. You really need to include the bicycle master plan as part of this whole set of policies and actions. I get around by bicycle, and I'm going to turn 65 this year. And right now, the bicycle infrastructure really isn't sufficient for an old person. And I think we really need to make some serious changes if this is going to be a city that I get old in, and I'd like to. So I support the plan. I support putting pricing in thoughtfully and great speed, and I encourage you to support it as well. But put in that bike plan, please. Thank you.
Mayor, that completes testimony.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody who testified today. Colleagues, if there are any questions, this is our chance to do so before I call the roll. Commissioner Mapps.
I have a question for staff. I think I appreciate all the testimony in the report. Could we get a quick summary of where we are in this process? Let's remind both ourselves and the people watching at home what's happened, what we hope to happen next, and what the next several steps are going to look like.
Shoshana, if you're speaking, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I just realized that. Yeah, so this is completing the phase of work where we were looking at all this with the task force, and we just talked about all the recommendations. What this resolution does now is direct us to take those recommendations and go deeper. And there's a lot of different policies that they're talking about. So we need to dive in. We have the POEM principles, which sort of give us guidelines, even for each particular one, how at a high level to develop them, but we need to go deeper on each particular area and really develop specific policies. And the 9-month period is when, again, hearing that urgency. I know some folks said it wasn't still urgent enough, but knowing that we do have a lot of deeper work to do, that was the timeline when we said, okay, we're going to do sort of first a little bit more staff analysis, taking those.
Thank you very much.
Sort of crosswalking the principles and the specific policies, and then do more outreach as well, particularly with some of the impacted stakeholders that haven't been involved to date. And then we hope to come back with some more specifics. I don't think in 9 months it will be, here's our plan to implement all of them. It will be, here's a few that we're ready to recommend moving forward on next, and then updates on where we are with the other ones.
Thanks. That's helpful. One of the reasons why I asked is I've looked at some of the media coverage, which was anticipating today's report. And for example, I see one media outlet that says Council's going to meet today to approve 2 plans that would increase the cost of driving in Portland. Is that what we did today?
No, there's no actual increases of it. There's nothing being implemented today. This resolution directs us to keep doing more work.
Great, and I look forward to that work. I want to express my great appreciation for the great thinking that we heard today. And I'll just tip my hand. As we think about how to flesh out these ideas, I sure hope that city staff think about equity in the terms of affordability for low-income Portlanders. I think there's an inherent kind of paradox we're trying to navigate here. I suspect we can navigate it, but I'm not quite sure how. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Mapps. Any further questions?
Sure. I'll ask.
Commissioner Ryan, go ahead.
Thanks. Now, I could save these for my remarks, but I thought it'd just be good for the public record. First of all, that was an amazing presentation. Thank you. It was really thorough. And I know I brought up the inclusion of freight, and I appreciated our brief dialogue on that, Shoshana. And also, I liked your graph that showed the influence of what the city could actually get done, kind of the control influence area. What was missing for me, and so this is just some feedback as you move forward, is the impact. Clearly, the goal is to reduce carbon emissions, correct? So what is the impact of each strategy that will reduce carbon emissions? And then that leads to what I think everyone really wants in the community, which is a lot of clarity on the community-wide indicators, the dashboard on what success looks like. So that also gives us the accountability that we need going forward. So that's something I'd expect to see in the next 9 months. When I was looking at who was involved, I saw the names, but I didn't see the affiliations. And I think it's really important that we include affiliations of task force members so we can really see the collective impact of the work. I tend to like to have the tension in the room on the front end and include those, like we heard from the one gentleman who was a convert. I love hearing about those converts, but I also like knowing who in the room, everyone being on the same page on the front end doesn't make for a very interesting task force. I'm not saying that happened, but right now it's hard to see where the collective impact was of every sector. And we need them all to line up as we save our climate. On that last comment would be a 16 of 18, we're all in. And that's wonderful, but I'm curious what the two that were descending had to say. So it'd be nice to have the transparency of their feedback as well. So those are just a few comments, and it's really in the spirit of having everything included on the front end and that necessary tension that really gets us to population level success. And when we isolate and don't have all that inclusion on the front end, it's harder to implement that success, which was what we all truly want, which is fresh air. Thanks.
Thanks, Commissioner Ryan. Commissioner Hardest.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Commissioner Ryan, for both your statements and your questions. I really want to appreciate where we are at this moment, right? And we've heard from many of the speakers today about the sense of urgency. And I am really proud of where we are because we didn't come today and say, like, adopt this now, and we're just going to move forward on it. What we said was we've taken a deep dive and we've got some ideas, but we need more data. And Commissioner Ryan, your question about other stakeholders, the presentation clearly said that that's the next step, is to get a bigger stakeholder group and to continue that dialogue, right? The sense of urgency on my part is both that we are in a climate emergency. We are, in fact, the Earth's on fire, and we do have to act as quickly as we possibly can. But at the same time, we actually have to be thoughtful, knowing that the state is in the process of creating some pricing mechanism that will impact Portlanders as well. And so I think between the work at the state level and some of the changes that we still must see at the state level and the work that we're planning to do at the local level, I just think that I would like us to start tomorrow, but the reality is that we're not there yet. And but I appreciate the thoughtful process, and I am so proud to be working with BPS and Commissioner Rubio because we are committed to making sure that we have a climate just future, and not just in our bureaus, but I know the mayor is also committed. So I just want to assure people that this is fabulous work put forth to us today by an incredible group of volunteers who, again, did not miss a beat during some of the most trying times in our city's history. So I look forward to what comes next. I look forward to moving this work forward. And again, my appreciation is just really huge for the time, the commitment, and the thoughtfulness that this work has been done. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, would anybody have an objection if I invite one more person to testify? They logged on a little bit late, but they're here. Sharon, why don't you go ahead? 2 minutes, please. Name for the record.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Just a second, Mayor Wheeler. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Got multiple Google Docs up. Yeah, Mayor Wheeler, Portland City Commissioners, my name is Aaron Brown. I'm testifying to you today as a board member of Portland Neighbors Welcome, a housing justice advocacy organization. I'm calling in this morning in support of the resolution to adopt the pricing options for equitable mobility findings. And on behalf of Portland Neighbors Welcome, we urge the city to implement the recommendations aggressively. I want to talk about one of my favorite foods in the world, the reliable, dependable peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It was always an after-school special in my house. As a scrawny teen with adolescent metabolism, as well as a perpetually hungry college student, the PB&J was an absolute staple in my younger years, and I'll admit that while my diet has improved, it's still my go-to meal between Zoom meetings like today. The thing about peanut butter and jelly is that they need each other to succeed. Peanut butter by itself is salty and chewy. Toast with jelly, I know peanut butter simply isn't filling, at least to me. These two ingredients deeply complement each other and play to each other's strengths. It's within this framework that I'm going to suggest that housing and transportation reforms go together like peanut butter and jelly. Let's be explicit. The successes of our new land use policies, including the residential infill project and better housing by design, hinges on Portlanders being able to walk, ride bikes, and take transit safely and conveniently. There simply isn't the geometric space in our city to build the housing that we need without dramatically reforming how much of our urban space is taking over for private automobile storage, whether on or off street. POEM incentivizes less car ownership, raises money to improve transit and or reduce its prices, and offers solutions to the perceived problem of parking congestion associated with infill housing. We are impressed by and grateful for Pbot's thoughtful, deliberate efforts to propose new policy solutions that prioritize equity, climate, and fairness. All of Pbot's work and all of the work of the community members who comprise the large advisory committee will only provide tangible benefit to everyday Portlanders if this slate of policies is fully implemented and without delay. The community and the government have provided the playbook to reform our transportation system, and today we call on the city's elected officials to act on it. We simply cannot afford to delay this important initiative if we truly want Portlanders to act for transportation justice, housing justice, and climate justice. In closing, I urge you to pass this resolution, recognize the hard work is yet to come in program design and implementation, and I ask the city to move forward with haste and determination in the next phase of this project. I'm going to go eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and I hope you will all join me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, colleagues, with that, I see no further hands raised. Keelan, please call the roll on the resolution.
Maps.
I want to thank the members of POEM for their hard work and really great and compelling study. As this transitions over to staff to be fleshed out, I sure hope that we will continue to explore and expand on equity issues, especially equity issues surrounding affordability. But I look forward to the work and ideas that you come up with over the next 9 months or so. And for those reasons, I vote aye.
Rubio.
I want to thank Shoshana, Emma, and Pbot, Ingrid and the BPS team, Commissioner Hardesty and her team, and the task force members for their excellent and thoughtful work here. And I also want to thank my colleagues for their great feedback and questions because it helps us go deeper. This was a very compelling presentation, and it's clear that the task force took a nuanced and deep look at what equitable mobility means and should look like in Portland. And it means people being able to get around easily, safely, and comfortably without a car. It also means decreasing carbon emissions by reducing driving trips, giving people who have been displaced from their homes and pushed to outer Portland an affordable and realistic and clean option to use electric vehicles. But it also means incentivizing owners of heavy duty freight and delivery vehicles and those who often profit while Portlanders suffer health consequences to switch to low carbon fuels. And as you've heard from staff today, we need new tools. And what we're doing right now isn't enough on its own to move the needle in the ways that we need to. 8.5 years. This is not easy stuff. And these new things can be very complicated and complex, But as Aaron Grimmer testified, there's also a real communications problem to tackle here. And another testifier, Andre Lightsey Walker, also said that it's about behavior change first. So I just want to elevate that as well. And this task force has laid the critical groundwork and roadmap to help us move all of these things forward if we design it carefully and methodically. And by starting the process this way and with the community and equity focused in the conversation, we're ready to develop these tools and come up with the innovative solutions that will reduce disparities and advance our climate and equity goals. So I'm excited to see what staff comes back with in 9 months. And I really appreciate them moving forward with the urgency that we all need to see. I vote aye.
Ryan.
Yes, I'd like to start off by thanking Commissioner Rubio and Commissioner Hardesty. Clearly, you picked up with these bureaus and brought this to where we are today. And so that was noted in your staff. And this is a primary goal for the entire council. It's a really important issue that we spent some time on today. I also want to recognize the amazing staffing, Shoshana and Emma. I hope you appreciated the thoughtful, kind comments that came your way for shepherding this along. You don't always hear that, and it seemed very thoughtful and sincere. The task force members, thank you. You provided some amazing testimony that made me want to second what Commissioner Rubio said. In my career, I've found that changing adult behavior is by far the most difficult thing we can ever do in life. You really know that when you're working in the education sector. Kids are resilient, they change quickly, but adults, not so much. So anyway, I thought it was great that the testimony that focused on that from Street Trust, it kind of tipped it from, I thought, some of the testimony focusing on revenue. So it was great to hear that perspective. This is a very complex and important issue. So complex challenges like this take complex solutions. And I thought you really dove into that today. The findings in this report. Oh, also before I forget, I want to acknowledge the testimony that came. And I got to do a shout out to Aaron because I was like, oh no, not another person's going to testify. I need to eat. And then he talked about peanut butter and jelly. So it was really important in that metaphor to look at how you're connecting the dots. And so I wasn't surprised to see low-income housing advocates testifying today. Thank you for being here. These findings in this report for the pricing options for Equitable Mobility Task Force, POEM, offer us a real opportunity to plan for and implement equitable mobility options that will meet the needs of the growing economy, residents, and climate. So thanks again for connecting the dots. Our office looks forward to being in touch with my fellow commissioners, and I know that 9 months will go fast and you have a lot of work to do. So keep working on including those that might be the doubters, because again, we won't be able to implement without them. Thank you. I vote aye.
Hardesty.
My cursor seems to be moving in slow motion today. I want to start by thanking Commissioner Rubio and her fabulous team. I want to thank Director Warner, Director Durbin for your strong leadership of this project through some really challenging times. I also want to thank Shoshana and Emma. You did incredible work. I knew it was incredible before you presented it. And you couldn't present everything today. There's certainly some areas that I want us to take a deeper dive in, like the fact of people of color not feeling safe in public spaces in the city of Portland and how that is impacting people's choices when it comes to transportation. When I got Portland Bureau of Transportation in my portfolio, I never imagined just the incredible impact we could have in both creating a more climate just community and a more equitable transportation system. You talked about these regional connections. I am at those regional tables because of my position as the commissioner in charge of transportation. And I can assure you, we're having these conversations in every single table that I'm at. And we know that if we do not start off with equity as the core of our effort, we will once again leave people of color behind and people with disabilities, and we will be developing programs into the future to try to address our failure. This is an opportunity for us to do it right from the beginning. And I am so proud that both you understand the need for more community engagement and that we will have those hard conversations with people who, as I think it was Aaron or someone put so eloquently, people who are used to using our roadways for free. There is a cost. That's why we have a $5 billion maintenance backlog. There is a cost. That's why we have high asthma and other health issues. There is a cost with people who have been pushed out to the edges of our city. We must ensure that any pricing mechanisms we put in place does not exacerbate the inequities that were here before COVID, were exposed during COVID, and will still exist when COVID is a distant memory. And so I applaud the work of the task force. I applaud all the staff and the innovation that went into this. I can tell you personally, for me, I remember way back when I was battling with Commissioner Udaly about whether or not we should be charging people to use the road. When I learn better, I do better too. And you guys have done a great job of educating me and preparing me to lead us through what's going to be some very challenging couple of years. So I'm very happy to vote aye.
Wheeler.
Yeah, thank you, Honor. Thank Commissioner Hardesty and Commissioner Rubio. Thank you both for this, as well as for the POEM task force. Thank you. It was a great presentation. I just want to quickly relate a conversation I had yesterday with some youth activists. They were some of the leaders of the climate strike. As you know, a couple of weeks ago, they were here at City Hall by the thousands. And these were some of the young activists who led that effort. They came with several, what they described as demands. And I hope they had the opportunity to see this report being given as well, because two of their key points that they made when they were meeting with me, the first sort of key point that I would stress is a sense of urgency. And that while they are appreciative that we are taking the time to engage community, that we're taking the time to make sure we have good strategies, they would, if they were here, remind us that time is limited. This is something that has to be taken up as a priority for the city of Portland. The second area which this report is all about is the question of equity as we seek climate justice, understanding that it has disproportionately impacted communities of color, low-income folks, and that therefore the work that we do must put those communities first and foremost. And I believe this report clearly underscored equitable mobility as being the key outcome for all of this. Last but not least, they would make the point that if we're talking about how, climate justice and housing justice are intimately related. And they would remind us of that. That's a really good point that they were making yesterday in their meeting with me. And this report and Aaron's testimony, I believe it was right at the end, really underscored this point. We can't talk about transportation equity without talking about housing equity. And although the Southwest Corridor didn't quite develop the way I think that ODOT and others would like to have seen it develop, I was really proud of the work that we did around the Housing Bureau at that time to prioritize low income and affordable housing alongside, in fact, in front of the transportation investments. And we've established that now as a city priority. This report certainly embraces that as a city priority. And it's certainly what I'm hearing from those who are deeply concerned about progress towards carbon reduction. So I just thought you guys hit some great points. I look forward to the work ahead on this, and I'm very happy to vote aye. The resolution is adopted. Thank you, everybody who worked so hard on this. Next up, Keelan to the regular agenda, item 747, please.
Amend price agreement with Gray Bar Electric Company, Inc. to increase the annual not to exceed amount to $2 million for electrical, lighting, data communications, and security products and services.
Colleagues, this ordinance amends a citywide price agreement with Gray Bar Electric Company Incorporated. It was approved by the council back in 2020. The agreement supplies electrical, lighting, data communications, and security products and services to various city bureaus as necessary. More recently, it's provided for a consolidated purchasing and installation model that creates greater compliance, efficiency, and value within our purchasing systems for the Bureau of Technology Services. This ordinance will increase the yearly not to exceed amount from $1 million to $2 million to accommodate these new services and greater usage by city bureaus. Chief Procurement Officer Pbot Taylor is here to present the ordinance. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mayor. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Pbot Taylor, he, him pronouns. This measure is essentially put forward to provide greater flexibility for our BTS Bureau. The first year exceeded the planned spend by $466,000. We encumbered $1 million in year one, and we have POs for $466,000 over that $1 million. So based on that trajectory, BTS requests additional spend under this blanket agreement for the final 2 years of the agreement. So essentially, we're providing a just-in-time source for BTS to source items such as IT hardware and other items that are needed on BTS citywide projects, including electrical, lighting, data communication, and security products.
Thank you, Director Taylor. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Director Taylor. My understanding is this is really because of our significant increase in data usage because of the Zoom world we've lived in for the last, 20 months now?
Yes, that's a contributing factor, Commissioner Hardesty. That's correct.
Thank you so much. That's my only question.
All right, very good. Any further questions? Keelan, do we have any public testimony on this emergency ordinance?
Nope, no one signed up.
Very good. Please call the roll.
Maps.
Aye.
Rubio.
Aye.
Ryan.
Aye.
Hardesty.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. Thank you, Director Taylor. The ordinance is adopted. Next up, item 748, that is a second reading.
Amend Human Resources Administrative Rule Funeral and Bereavement Leave to define and clarify eligibility for leave.
So we took public testimony on this item. We heard a presentation during the first reading. Is there any further business on this item? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Maps.
I just want to thank all the staff who worked on this important item and thank everyone who gave testimony on this. I think that this reform makes our city more just and more humane. And for those reasons, I vote aye.
Rubio.
I want to thank the mayor, HR staff, and other city employees and affinity groups that participated and co-created this policy. It's great to see the real ways that reflect how we form families and relationships. So for that reason, I support it and I vote aye.
Ryan.
Yes, thank you for the work last week that was brought forward. It was very relevant and kind of surprising that this hasn't been passed years ago. So anyway, about time, I vote aye.
Hardesty.
I want to thank Ashley for her follow-up with some of the questions that I had last week about financial impact. And it is correct that it will have financial impact in some bureaus more so than others. But I want to be really clear. This is absolutely the right policy at the right time for the right city. And I'm 100% in favor of adopting this ordinance. I'm happy to vote aye.
Wheeler.
I thought it was a great presentation and I appreciate our employees bringing it forward. I vote aye. The ordinance is adopted. Next item, 749, please.
Accept Portland Bureau of Transportation's Way to Go plan, a transportation demand management strategy to advance mobility, climate, and equity goals.
Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to move this item back to my office.
Without objection. And with that, colleagues, we will reconvene this afternoon, not at our usual time. We reconvene this afternoon at 3:30 p.m. Until then, we are adjourned.